Wait for me! Before Xavier could reach the passageway, he suddenly heard a shout below, following which a figure darted in his direction and grabbed onto his robe. "Who are you?" Xavier asked. The person who had grabbed onto him was none other than the familiar face among the crowd, Harper. "It's extremely dangerous to proceed any further than this. It would be best for you to remain behind," Xavier said as he raised his palm, intending to send the young woman back to the ground. Through his communication with the Elder earlier, he had heard that there were not just sempiternal realm otherworldly demons in the exteriors of the Temple of Confucius. It was very likely that there were ancient sages as well. It was an extremely treacherous place where he couldn't even guarantee his own safety. Considering how Harper was only a Saint Level 9 cultivator at the moment, it was practically suicide for her to enter as well. In any case, he had disguised himself as someone else, so it wasn't as if Harper knew it was him. Just as Xavier was about to make the move, he heard a voice speaking telepathically in his mind. "Xavier Matthews, if you dare to throw me down, I'll run straight to your Matthews clan and claim that you poisoned me." What? Xavier nearly fainted upon hearing those words. "How did you know it was me?" He dared not claim that his disguise was flawless, but he was confident that even ancient sages would have difficulties trying to see through his disguise. Considering how Harper was only at Saint Level 9 Pinnacle, how did she recognize him? More importantly, she even threatened to wreak havoc at the Matthews clan. Of course, it wasn't as if anyone would believe it, but just thinking of how embarrassing it would be for the head of the 3 premier clans and the Sanctum of Sages, as well as a 9-star master teacher, to have a young woman claiming that he had poisoned her. Even if no one would believe it, his dignified reputation would be ripped apart. More importantly, what if Eva heard of the matter? Sighing deeply, Xavier shook his head and replied telepathically, "It is dangerous on the other side, but think it over carefully." "I want to go," Harper insisted resolutely. Very well then. Seeing that Harper was adamant, Xavier knew that he wouldn't be able to shake her off. Thus he grabbed her and dashed into the spatial passageway. They warped into 2 streaks of light as they dashed right through the spatial passageway. Barely an instant after they disappeared from sight, it dissipated, and the spatial restrictions swiftly reformed themselves. Watching as everything reverted back to normal, the crowd of ex-captives stood back up. They had thought that they were doomed, but before they knew it, the otherworldly demons had already been killed, and their benefactor had left through the spatial passageway, leaving them dazed. "Elder, what should we do?" The crowd turned to the Elder whom Xavier had communicated with earlier. He was the strongest cultivator among them, so it was inevitable that the crowd would think highly of his input. The Elder pondered for a moment before replying, "Since the otherworldly demons have been killed, we should be out of danger for the time being. Why don't we focus our attention on cultivating? Once the Temple of Confucius closes, we won't have such a chance anymore." To be honest, even if someone inflated his guts tenfold, he would not have dared to head to the exteriors of the Temple of Confucius. He valued his life far too much to put himself at such risk. Since that was the case, he might as well cultivate where he was and try to push for a breakthrough as soon as possible. You're right." The crowd nodded in agreement. Having just come close to death's grip, their appetite for risk was at an all-time low. Knowing that being too ambitious would only come back to bite them, they didn't think it was wise to test the limits of their capabilities. Looking at the sky where the duo had vanished into, the Elder remarked deeply, "Who could have thought that there would be such a formidable young man on the Master Teacher continent? His capabilities can nearly be said to be on par with the great Xavier Matthews." However, before he could finish his words, his body suddenly froze on the spot. Matthew Xavier. Xavier Matthews. Could it be? As such a realization struck him, a bitter smile surfaced on his face. It seemed like it was true that real experts paid no heed to petty details. Could he have been any more perfunctory with the name he made up for himself? Anyone would have been able to connect the dots once they had some time to think over it after the matter. Are you sure that you're trying to hide your identity from the world and not proclaiming yourself to everyone you come by? I guess this means that I'm indebted to him. I'll have to make sure to repay this debt to the Matthews clan in the future. A life debt was not something that he could shrug off. Since he knew the other party's identity, he would have to find some way to return the favor to the Matthews clan in the future. Traveling across the spatial seal, Xavier and Harper fell to the ground at the same time. In the foreground, one could vaguely see a massive structure floating in the air. Have we arrived? Harper shook her head in an attempt to expel her dizziness as she got to her feet. It seems so, Xavier replied. The spatial laws in the dimension that he had just entered were far stricter than the forest dimension, the desert dimension, and the ice dimension. Even with his prowess, he couldn't even fly at all. In the previous locations, he could at least still fly at a low altitude, but in this dimension, he could only obediently travel on foot, just like an ordinary mortal. Harper pointed at the massive structure in the distance and asked as she tidied her clothes, "Is that the Temple of Confucius?" Xavier nodded in response. It seemed like the elder was right. Traveling through the spatial seal would bring him to the exterior of the Temple of Confucius. However, it might not be a good decision to rush right over. Considering the dangers lurking around the area, it was best for him to clarify the situation before heading over. This was even more so given that it was a passageway opened up by the otherworldly demonic tribe. If there was an otherworldly demon ancient sage lying around, they would really die painfully. With a flick of his wrist, the bound Calypso appeared before him. Soul Search. Knowing that Calypso wouldn't speak no matter how he interrogated him, Xavier couldn't be bothered to waste his effort questioning the other party. Without any hesitation, he executed Soul Search on the other party right away. Information swiftly surged into Xavier's mind. Just as he had heard from the Elder earlier, the outer perimeter of the Temple of Confucius was made up of 6 dimensions. The exits and entrances were linked to one another, so if one traveled from one exit to another, one would only be moving around in circles. This was intelligence that Calypso had received from Sovereign Ozias. As for how Calypso was able to receive the information from Sovereign Ozias when he was unable to use a Communication Jade token, the secret lay in the altar. The spirit god that the otherworldly demonic tribe revered was simply so powerful that even though the Temple of Confucius was created by Keith Cole himself, it did not wield sufficient strength to stop that powerful figure beyond those doors. Xavier's eyebrows shot up in worry. Sovereign Ozias was able to send information in here, and it's likely that he's entered the Temple of Confucius as well. Previously, he had heard that the most powerful otherworldly demon emperor had discreetly entered the Master Teacher continent. From the looks of it, it was likely that that person was Sovereign Ozias. No one in the Master Teacher Pavilion had met Sovereign Ozias before, but it was definite that he was an ancient sage expert. It left Xavier feeling a little unnerved to know that there was such a powerful expert lying around him. However, why would Sovereign Ozias command Calypso not to kill Master Teachers? There was another peculiar command that Calypso had received that left Xavier feeling a little perplexed. During the trip that he'd made to the subterranean gallery, he had learned that the otherworldly demonic tribe was divided into 3 factions. Based on the information he had gathered so far, Sovereign Ozias was a conservative leader who opposed a full-blown war against the humans. On the other hand, Sovereign Lorcan was more belligerent, supporting aggression against mankind in order to bring as many benefits to the otherworldly demonic tribe as possible. As for Sovereign Demetrius, he seemed to be sitting on the fence. There was a period of time when he allied himself with Sovereign Ozias, but currently it seemed like he had switched sides to support Sovereign Lorcan instead. Since Sovereign Ozias was a conservative leader, he probably had his own concerns in order to pass a non-aggression order against the Master Teachers. Perhaps he was unwilling to further sour the relations with mankind. Very soon, Xavier finished browsing through all of the useful information he had acquired from Calypso. All in all, Calypso had only received orders to lead the otherworldly demons to open up a passageway using the altar to enter the Temple of Confucius. There were no other orders aside from that. As for further intelligence regarding the Temple of Confucius, it was hard to tell whether Sovereign Ozias was withholding information from his subordinate, or that he'd not scouted that far yet, but there was nothing at all. After conducting the soul search, Xavier placed his palm lightly on Calypso's head and killed him. In the end, he still could not bring himself to believe in the otherworldly demonic tribe. Whether Sovereign Ozias was expressing goodwill to them or not, it was too much of a luxury for mankind to simply believe in the goodwill of the otherworldly demonic tribe. That would be no different from betting the fate of mankind on the enemy's kindness, and that was utter foolishness. Furthermore, it was just a few days ago that the otherworldly demonic tribe had attempted to launch a major invasion on mankind. In the end, it was still better to be safe than sorry. Sighing deeply, Xavier raised his head to scan his surroundings for danger when his eyebrow suddenly shot up. He flicked his wrist and a jade token appeared in his palm. A line of words surfaced on it. "Exaf, when you see this message, hurry over to where we are. We've just caught sight of Sarah." "They've caught sight of Sarah!" The one who had sent him the message was none other than his father, the Sword. Did they manage to get here as well? Xavier's eyes lit up. From his experience in the previous 3 dimensions, he had found that he was unable to send messages to everyone else. Could the reason that his communication jade token had suddenly begun trembling be because his parents, the Sword Saint, were in the same dimension as him? Or was the restriction to send messages lifted in this dimension? Xavier tapped his finger on the communication jade token and swiftly crafted a message before sending it over. "Where are you all?" A moment later, the communication jade token lit up and a line of words appeared. "The Hall of Great Accomplishment, Pavilion of Warm Spring." Pavilion of Warm Spring? Xavier frowned. Putting aside whatever pavilion his parents were in, he didn't even know where the Hall of Great Accomplishment was. Let's take a look around. Xavier sighed deeply. In any case, the Temple of Confucius was right ahead of him. Since his father was able to send him the exact name of their location, he should be able to find it with some looking around. Harper looked at Xavier intently and asked, "Are we heading over as well?" Given that we're already approaching the vicinity of the Temple of Confucius, it's likely that we will encounter many powerful experts. If we encounter any danger later on, I want you to turn around and flee right away. There's no need to worry about me, understand? Xavier instructed sternly. Harper knew that Xavier was worried about her, but she still couldn't help but retort in displeasure. You're thinking that I'm still a burden, aren't you? Well, my cultivation hasn't reached great stage yet. My fighting prowess is still decent. But the reason I was captured back at the Ice Dimension is because they caught me by surprise with a soul attack. Half a year ago, this fellow had still been a junior whom she could bully as she liked, but at that moment, she found that she couldn't keep up with him no matter how far she pushed herself, and this realization filled her with frustration. Of course not. There's no way that I would think of you as a burden. As long as you flee quickly enough away in the face of trouble, there's no way that you can be a burden to me. Xavier nodded in agreement. It was such a nostalgic feeling to Harper, being stifled by that fellow's words to the point that she felt like passing out. The reason that she had said that her fighting prowess was decent was to tell him that she would be able to lend her hand in times of danger. There was no way she was going to pull him back. Yet, all he could think about was having her escape so she wouldn't drag him down in battle. Harper gritted her teeth. The next moment, however, she suddenly put on a provocative smile as she strutted toward Xavier in a manner that showed off her curvaceous body. With a seductive voice that would make any man's heart pound, she purred, "Are you doubting my abilities? Shall we make a bet, then?" A bet? That's right. I'll perform a dance, and if your state of mind is affected by my dance, I want you to apologize to me. You'll never say words like asking me to run whenever we encounter danger again. On the other hand, if you can remain unfazed by my dance, I'll do whatever you tell me to from now onward. I'll not cause any trouble for you. Harper eyed Xavier intently with her crescent eyes. Fine by me. Seeing that Harper was insistent on the matter, Xavier nodded. In truth, he was also interested in seeing what a pinnacle terpsichore was capable of. While Harper's cultivation was lacking, she did inherit the highest heritage of the Terpsichore Guild headquarters, so it would indeed be foolish to simply disregard her capabilities. With a simple step forward, Harper began her dance. In the blink of an eye, she seemed to have transformed into a lithe fairy from the heavens. Her graceful movements and ethereal disposition harmonized with one another to produce a charm that seemed to draw one's soul in. One look was all it took for a man to fall under her spell, captured by her charisma. Xavier had to admit that Harper's figure was truly perfect, even among all the women that he'd met so far. While she couldn't switch into more beautiful clothes due to the environment, her slightest movement and subtle gestures seemed to electrify one's soul over and over again. Not bad. Xavier nodded in approval. Harper's confidence in her fighting prowess was not unfounded. Even though her cultivation was only at Saint Level 9 Pinnacle, her dance could easily cause even great Sage Level 2 Aureate Body Realm cultivators to lose control of themselves. While it did work for cultivators of both genders, it was particularly effective on male cultivators. Even Sempiternal Realm male cultivators might fall for her terpsichorean art if caught off guard. As the saying went, even the mightiest of heroes would find it hard to resist the charms of beauty. In the very first place, Harper was an incredibly beautiful and charismatic individual. Without resorting to terpsichorean arts, her disposition and demeanor carried the ability to draw others to her. Coupled with her dance, even with the limitations of her cultivation, she was still able to exude a charm that others would find hard to resist. Of course, there was still a distinction between making her opponents succumb to her terpsichorean art and killing them. Due to the limitations of her cultivation, she would have difficulties trying to leave a mark on the body of Aureate Body Realm cultivators, even with a weapon in hand. You are unaffected by my attacks? As the dance came to an end, Harper's movements slowly trailed to a beautiful stop. Looking at the clear, innocent eyes of the young man standing opposite her, her posture couldn't help but slump in disappointment. Due to her God-sent appearance and figure, she had swiftly been chosen as the Inceptive Sage candidate shortly after entering the Terpsichore Guild headquarters. The reason that she'd been given permission to enter the Temple of Confucius was because she had already mastered the highest heritage of the Terpsichore Guild headquarters, which granted her the ability to protect herself even when faced with great sage cultivators. Given the abilities that she now wielded, when she met Xavier once more, the thought of competing with him to determine who was superior immediately surfaced in her mind. Back when she was still at the Imleal Master Teacher Academy, she couldn't even begin to count how many men had fallen before her skirt. There were no male master teachers who wouldn't view her in deference, fearing to cross her path. The fellow standing before her, Xavier, was the only thick-headed oaf blind to her charms, viewing her as no different from anyone else. She had thought that she would finally be able to face this thick-headed oaf after inheriting the highest heritage of the Terpsichore Guild headquarters. But, to her astonishment, the eyes of that thick-headed oaf were actually clearer than she remembered them being. Right when she was feeling utterly defeated, Xavier suddenly spoke. Well, I have to admit that I was a little affected by it. Really? Harper's eyes lit up, but the next moment, as if suspecting that Xavier was just trying to console her, she eyed him with skepticism. I don't see any trace of you being affected by my dance, though. Your aerial dance of Linglong was well performed, but you managed to capture the demeanor of a fairy soaring into the heavens perfectly, leaving the spectators feeling like they were in a dream. However, the flaws in your dance are very apparent as well. Firstly, your movements were too intentional. The charm of a fairy is accentuated not by flaunting her figure, but through the transcendental air in her gestures and movements. What you should be focusing on is the ethereal, not the worldly. And secondly, the intent of your dance is way too blatant. Well, this causes cultivators to put up their defenses, making it harder than ever to breach their mental resilience, and without stopping to catch his breath, Xavier pointed out 17 flaws, after which he paused for a moment before carrying on. What should I... God, The dance that you performed earlier simply had too many flaws such that I couldn't watch it anymore. It left me feeling a little nauseated. Well, you also know that I am a perfectionist, so... Harper felt tears brimming in her eyes. All of a sudden, all she could see was hopeless despair ahead of her as her career as a terpsichore. There's no need to be disheartened, Xavier said with a face so earnest that no one could fault him for his words. These are the corrections that I made for the dance that you just performed. Well, as long as you study these, you should be able to further your terpsichorean art. Well, this way, I guess your dance won't be as nauseating to me anymore. Harper rubbed between her eyebrows in distress. As stifled as Harper was feeling, she still quickly memorized the flaws and corrections that Xavier had stated, following which she began to study his words closely. The more she pondered over his words, the more convinced she felt that he was right. His words were deep, but at the same time they were simple and direct. Her body began to move along with his words, and once again she performed the aerial dance of Linglong. Her movements became faster and faster, and her gestures became more and more ethereal. Some time later, a rush of gleam surged into her body. To her surprise, her Saint Level 9 bottleneck suddenly loosened, allowing her cultivation to surge right up to the introspective convalescence realm. I actually made a breakthrough! Harper's body froze in astonishment. Her eyes instinctively turned toward the young man with conflicting emotions rippling within them. The young man was able to see through the flaws in her dance so easily, and just by following his directions, she could correct those flaws and advance her cultivation and terpsichorean art. From the looks of it, it seemed like being useless to him didn't sound that bad anymore. At the very least, she was able to receive his guidance. Oh, whatever. If he takes it I'm useless, so be it. I'll just follow him around and fish for a couple of pointers here and there. I'll be spared from so much hard work just by leeching off of him. Just like that, Harper's fighting spirit was ignited once more. All right, let's hurry up and head over. Harper's breakthrough was completely within Xavier's expectations. As long as the other party was able to receive his guidance humbly, he would be able to make the other party achieve a breakthrough so easily that the other party would begin doubting themselves. This was the ability that he wielded, being humble and low profile. Knowing that Xavier had urgent matters to attend to, Harper didn't dare to delay him any longer. She followed quietly behind him while reinforcing her cultivation. They began making their way toward the Temple of Confucius. The magnificent structure floated in the distant sky, appearing vaguely in sight. With incredible speed, the duo flitted over. Xavier had expected the journey to be fraught with dangers, but it turned out to be so peaceful that it scared him. Putting aside otherworldly demons, he didn't even see a single beast along the way. 10 minutes later, they were finally standing before the magnificent structure. A plaque hanging at the entrance had 4 majestic words carved on it: Hall of Great Accomplishment. This must be one of the 6 subordinate halls of the Temple of Confucius. He had learned from Eva that there were 6 subordinate halls to the Temple of Confucius, and each of them corresponded to one celestial amulet of legacy. Without a doubt, the Hall of Great Accomplishment should be one of the 6 subordinate halls. Mist drifted across the entrance of the Hall of Great Accomplishment, obscuring it from view. Nevertheless, from the tightly shut gates, it seemed like no one had entered yet. Looking around the structure, Xavier found 4 pavilions in the area, named Warm Spring, Irate Summer, Cooling Autumn, and Frozen Winter. Ah, so that's the Pavilion of Warm Spring, Xavier thought as he made his way over to the pavilion marked with the words Warm Spring together with Harper. This pavilion wasn't too big. As soon as he entered the area, he saw a huge number of people standing in its vicinity. Some of them were dressed in master-teacher robes, whereas others wore the robes of their clan or casual wear. All in all, there were roughly 30 people. Even the weakest of them was at Saint Level 9. Upon seeing Xavier, a couple of figures walked forward to greet him.
Ah, Clanhead!
Xavier also recognized them. They were the Grand Elders of the Matthews clan. They had been in seclusion all this while, and they had arrived in Corfu 2 days prior. The current Xavier had already stripped off his disguise and reverted to his original appearance. "You're here!" Xavier was just about to ask where his parents were when he heard a voice coming from the distance, following which the Sword Saint walked over with hastened footsteps. Upon seeing that they were not injured, Xavier heaved a sigh of relief. At the same time, he couldn't help but notice something that stunned him. "How did you raise your cultivation so quickly?" Prior to entering the Temple of Confucius, they had only been at the Sempiternal Realm primary stage. However, in just a few short hours, they had actually managed to advance their cultivation to the Sempiternal Realm consummation, thus putting them at the very pinnacle of the Master-Teacher continent. Well, we stumbled upon a fortuitous encounter." Following which, the Sword began explaining with a smile. Upon hearing his explanation, Xavier was rendered speechless. His parents were far more fortunate than him. Instead of the 6 dimensions, they were teleported straight to the exterior of the Temple of Confucius. The spiritual energy and teacher's milieu here were far more concentrated than the 6 dimensions. Furthermore, it was filled with treasures when they had just arrived. With the aid of those treasures and their soul depth of 29.9, it was inevitable that their cultivation would surge by leaps and bounds. Seeing the incredulous look on her son's face, St. Lana added with a smile, "Furthermore, we haven't just been cultivating for a couple of hours. Rather, we've already been here for 3 months." 3 months? Xavier was taken aback. It had only been 12 hours since the Temple of Confucius opened. So, how in the world could they have cultivated there for 3 months? "Well, your father and I happened to stumble upon a blessed land where the flow of time is accelerated. As such, even though a couple of hours have only passed for the rest of you, we've already cultivated here for a very long time," St. Lana explained. Xavier widened his eyes in shock. Their luck was too overpowered. It was one thing for them to be teleported right to the exterior of the Temple of Confucius, but they had actually stumbled upon a blessed area with accelerated time on top of that. He couldn't help but think of the suffering that he'd gone through moving from one world to another, battling enemies one after another. "Do you know where the Blessed Land is? Could you find it again?" Xavier asked. If they could find it again, he would head in there and cultivate for a while to raise his fighting prowess before moving on to do anything else. "I don't think we'll be able to find it anymore. The Blessed Land activated when we came in contact with its mechanism, and when we were finally done cultivating, it vanished on its own. We tried looking for it afterward, but it was nowhere to be seen. Actually, even without relying on the Blessed Land, your cultivation speed is already fast enough as it is," St. Lana said. All right, then." Xavier rubbed between his eyebrows. Even though he was gladdened by the advancement in his parents' cultivation, he couldn't help feeling a little frustrated as well. He had always taken pride in the speed of his cultivation, but after such a long period of time, he was still stuck at the Orient Body Realm consummation, yet to take a single step forward at all. Sighing deeply, Xavier looked at his parents and asked, "How did you all get straight to the exterior of the Temple of Confucius? Well, I was teleported to the dimensions outside instead. And furthermore, how did the two of you remain together?" He had been teleported to the forest dimension outside, and he'd been unable to find any familiar faces at all. On the other hand, not only did his parents teleport straight to the exterior, from what he had heard from them, it seemed like they'd never been separated from one another. "It probably has something to do with the Celestial Amulet of Legacy," the Sword replied. "When the Temple of Confucius first opened, your mother and I and a few other Grand Elders were in the midst of studying the Celestial Amulet of Legacy. Before we knew it, we'd already been teleported here. Furthermore, I can vaguely feel an inseparable relationship between the Celestial Amulet of Legacy and the whole of Great Accomplishment before us." Celestial Amulet of Legacy? Xavier lowered his head to look at the glowing amulet that the Sword was holding on to. It was emanating an aura that seemed to meld perfectly with the aura of the Hall of Great Accomplishment. It felt like they were actually a single entity that had been split in two, and there was a unique resonance between the two of them. If that celestial amulet of legacy teleported my parents here to the Hall of Great Accomplishment, then why didn't the one in my hand do anything of that sort? Xavier wondered in bewilderment. The celestial amulet of legacy in his grasp was the prime amulet. So, going by normal circumstances, should he not have been teleported straight to the Prime Hall? So far, he hadn't even seen the shadow of the Prime Hall. Instead, he was forced to travel through the forest dimension, desert dimension, and ice dimension. He knew he would face many dangers in the Temple of Confucius, but the least Little Amulet could do was point out a direction for him. Had he known that Little Amulet was actually so useless, he would have just thrown it away back then. Well, since your celestial amulet of legacy resonates with the Hall of Great Accomplishment, why didn't you all enter it? Xavier asked. Since they had already reached the destination, and had the required celestial amulet of legacy as well, why were they still idling outside the premises? Oh, we tried, but we were unable to open its massive doors. It's likely that the time hasn't come for it to be opened yet, the sword replied. Well, however, based on my observations, it's likely that it will open within about 4 hours or so. Through the windows, Xavier gazed at the nearby Hall of Great Accomplishment and noticed that the massive doors at its entrance were firmly shut, emanating a forbidding air. Despite the resonance between the Celestial Amulet of Legacy and the Hall of Great Accomplishment, it seemed like they had not fully harmonized with one another yet. In the Communication Jade token, you mentioned that you spotted Sarah's trail. Where is she? Xavier asked. He had been worrying about his students ever since they were kidnapped. While he had reassured himself time and time again that they would be fine, he still couldn't help but worry about their plight. She's at... The sword was just about to answer the question when a resounding explosion sounded in the air, following which the pavilion that they were in suddenly began quaking non-stop. They're here again. The sword stood up and narrowed his eyes. Who's here? Xavier asked with a frown. Otherworldly demons. They know that your father has a celestial amulet of legacy, so they come over every now and then to challenge us, St. Lana explained. Lowering his gaze, Xavier saw an otherworldly demon standing right in front of the pavilion. The otherworldly demon was gripping a sword in his hand, and he emanated an air of concentrated killing intent. The sword! I am Scorpio! Do you dare face me in a duel? The otherworldly demon bellowed with a voice reminiscent of a deafening bell. A duel? Xavier frowned. The otherworldly demons actually dared to appear in the open, and not to mention they're even adhering to rules? Based on what he knew, etiquette and such meant nothing to otherworldly demons. Driven by their bloodlust, they were mostly interested only in slaughter. Thus, it was extremely bizarre for an otherworldly demon to actually issue a formal challenge. More importantly, there were many powerful master teachers in the Pavilion of Warm Spring. Given that the deep-seated conflict between the master teachers and the otherworldly demons had gone on for tens of thousands of years, it was inevitable that both sides would have some loved ones who'd been killed by the other party. Was the otherworldly demon not afraid of being killed running over here like that? It's not that they want to adhere to the rules. They have no choice but to do so, the sword explained with a bitter smile. They have no choice but to do so? Xavier was perplexed by those words. A moment later, he widened his eyes in realization. Wait, could it be that there are ancient sages here? It was only in the presence of the ancient sages that even sempiternal realm consummation experts would be forced to obediently abide by rules. Indeed, there are ancient sages around the area. The ancient sage of our Matthews clan is here too. As the ancient sages of both sides are a little apprehensive about facing the other, they've come to an agreement to resolve any conflict by fair duel. Willful murder is prohibited. Otherwise there's no way that it would be so peaceful around here, the sword explained. Xavier nodded. It was no wonder he didn't encounter any danger along the way. It must have been due to the pact between the factions. Otherwise, it was likely that a war would have broken out before the subordinate hall even opened. Perhaps They might have even ended up whittling each other down, only to have the treasures end up in the hands of another. To use an analogy from his previous life, the ancient sages on both sides were like nuclear weapons keeping each other in check. The reason that neither side was willing to mobilize their ancient sages was because they knew that the scales would immediately tilt if they lost them. Considering how they hadn't even seen the Great Codex of Spring and Autumn yet, there was no reason for them to go all out and take on such a risk. And the reason that they're challenging me is because they wish to acquire the Celestial Amulet of Legacy in my hands, or possibly enter the Temple of Confucius right behind us. The Sword whipped out his sword and sneered coldly. However, how could I allow them to do as they please? Father, please wait a moment. Seeing that the Sword was about to head down, Xavier stood up and halted him. Allow me to face him instead. You? The Sword was taken aback. Indeed. While my cultivation is only at the Aureate Body Realm, I do have the strength to fend off Sempiternal Realm cultivators. Furthermore, I did stumble upon some minor fortuitous encounters on my way here, and I think that this will be a good opportunity for me to test myself, Xavier replied confidently. While the Sword had already reached Sempiternal Realm consummation, the enemy was no weakling. It was not that he didn't have any confidence in the Sword's fighting prowess, but he was simply unwilling to see any harm coming to the other party. The Sword assessed Xavier deeply for a moment, before nodding. All right, then. Take care. If you find yourself forced into a corner, run right back here. His son might have only been 20, but he possessed many means that made even the Master Teacher Pavilion headquarters apprehensive of him. To be honest, he wasn't confident of defeating Scorpio by himself. But his son very likely had the capability to pull it off. I will. Xavier nodded. After that, he leaped out of the pavilion and appeared right before the otherworldly demon. I'm Xavier. If you wish to challenge my father, you'll have to bypass me first. Are you able to make decisions here? It seemed like Scorpio didn't recognize Xavier. Seeing how young the fellow standing before him was, Scorpio eyed him skeptically. If you lose, I expect you to hand over the Celestial Amulet of Legacy. Of course I can. Xavier chuckled softly in response. If I lose, we'll hand the Celestial Amulet of Legacy over to you. However, what if I win? Scorpio flicked his wrist and took out a metallic set of armor that boasted astonishing flexibility. Patting the metallic armor forcefully, Scorpio harumphed. If you win, I will give this great sage armor to you as compensation. You're intending to trade the Celestial Amulet of Legacy for just one great sage artifact. Do you take me for a fool? Xavier's eyebrows shot up in disdain. Even the 100 schools of philosophers offered an ancient sage artifact to match the Celestial Amulet of Legacy. To offer a mere great sage artifact for the wager, the other party was really taking him too lightly. What do you want, then? Scorpio frowned. They had also conducted similar duels earlier, and even though their tribesmen had lost, the Sword didn't raise any requests. Why would this wager suddenly become unfair when it came to this young man? 3 great sage artifacts, Xavier demanded firmly. 3 great sage artifacts? Scorpio narrowed his eyes upon hearing the other party's demand. You're dreaming! So be it then. I can't be wasting my time on you either. You should know that the Celestial Amulet of Legacy is necessary to enter the Temple of Confucius. Well, it's only a subordinate hall, so the Great Codex of Spring and Autumn won't be in there. Well, regardless, the heritage of Keith Cole is bound to be extraordinary. You'd better think it through. But don't say that I didn't give you a chance when the time comes. If you aren't going to accept my duel, well, you should hurry up and say so. I'm exhausted from exploring the area, and I want to take a rest. Xavier stretched his back lazily as he walked back to the Pavilion of Warm Spring. Scorpio fell silent. 3 great sage artifacts was a hefty price to pay, but it came nowhere close in comparison to an opportunity to enter the Temple of Confucius and obtain Keith Cole's heritage. Give me a moment. I will return after discussing the matter with the others. Leaving these words behind, Scorpio turned around and headed to a pavilion not too far away with the words Irate Summer written on it. Not too long later, he returned and said, "I agree to your request." After saying those words, he flicked his wrist and 3 great sage artifacts materialized before him. In reciprocation, the sword stepped forward and placed the celestial amulet of legacy floating in the air as well.
Let us begin. I do not believe that a young brat in his 20s can possibly be a match for me.
Scorpio spat. With both sides offering up their stakes, Scorpio wasted no time in drawing his sword, prepared to leap right into the duel. Hold it for a moment. Before we begin, I believe there's a need for us to clarify the rules. Xavier raised his hand.
Yeah, rules.
Indeed. The battle between us should be regarded as a fair duel, right?
Yeah, of course.
Scorpio nodded in agreement. Since it's a fair duel, I should be able to make use of any skills at my disposal, right? But to put it in more straightforward terms, a formation master would be able to make use of his formations, and a beast tamer would be able to bring his tamed beasts into the battle. Does that sound fair to you? Xavier asked.
Of course. Whatever occupation you have, feel free to use those techniques in the battle.
Scorpio shrugged nonchalantly. A formation master's strength indubitably lay in setting formations, and a beast tamer's strength included his tamed beasts. They had devoted their time to furthering those arts in order to be able to use them in battle, so there was no denying that it was part of their capabilities as well. I see. Well, that makes things really easy then. Hearing Scorpio's agreement, Xavier flicked his wrist and commanded, "Tamed beasts, give that fellow a beating of his life." As soon as those words sounded, the 5 monarchs immediately materialized before Xavier and surrounded Scorpio. The sheer intensity of their auras combined seemed almost strong enough to tear this space apart.
"These are your tamed beasts?"
Scorpio staggered in utter shock upon seeing those 5 tamed beasts. At the same time, the Sword Saint and the many master teachers in the Pavilion of Warm Spring also widened their eyes to the brim, rendered speechless by the sight before them. "Indeed," Xavier said. "I'm a beast tamer, and we agreed that it's fair for me to use my tamed beasts in battle earlier, right? Hurry up and make your move then." Scorpio couldn't believe it. "If you aren't going to make the first move, I'll be going first then," Xavier remarked impatiently. Raising his hand, he passed down the order to attack. "Get him." The 5 Sempiternal Realm consummation beasts charged at Scorpio. Putting aside their cultivation realm, each of them carried the bloodline of the ancient divine beasts, and as the 5 monarchs of the Forest Dimension, they had survived many battles. Even though Scorpio was not weak, he wouldn't be a match for even a single one of them, let alone 5 at once. All it took was a few breaths for his body to be bruised, fractured, and bleeding all over. Knowing that he would die if he obstinately held on, Scorpio desperately screamed, That's more like it." Xavier nodded in satisfaction as he stowed the 3 great sage artifacts into his storage ring. Glancing at the Pavilion of Irate Summer, he said, "Is there anyone else who wants to challenge me? I, Xavier, am more than willing to play along. Otherwise, I'll challenge all of the otherworldly demons in the Pavilion of Irate Summer. Eh? Is there anyone who dares to take up my challenge?"
"Odysseus,
yet another conceited fool who overestimates himself just because he's accomplished something. Naive. You think that you're invincible just because you've tamed a couple of beasts." While Xavier was dueling Scorpio, quite a number of otherworldly demons had already headed out of the Pavilion of Irate Summer. Upon hearing the arrogant words spouting from Xavier's mouth, their faces turned livid with anger, and infuriated bellows escaped their lips. There were around 30 otherworldly demons in sight at the moment, and over 6 of them possessed similar strength to Scorpio. Even though Xavier had tamed 5 Sempiternal Realm consummation beasts, he still wouldn't stand a chance against all of them combined. "What's the use of arguing over there, huh? If you have the guts to accept my challenge, take out your treasures and stake them as wagers," Xavier replied. Similarly, I'll also put the Celestial Amulet of Legacy on the line. Those who possess true strength speak through actions, not through words. The faces of the otherworldly demons turned livid. The young man was right. Nothing they said would be meaningful. Strength was something that had to be displayed.
I'll give you 10 minutes to think about it. I'm gonna take a short nap for the time being. If you wish to take me up on my challenge, I don't mind playing with you all.
Xavier tossed those words to the otherworldly demons before returning to the Pavilion of Warm Spring while lazily stretching his back. Our clanhead sure is formidable. He's actually able to render so many otherworldly demons speechless at once.
This is the kind of imposing air that a true powerhouse should have.
The cultivators in the Pavilion of Warm Spring nodded. It was true that neither side dared to go too far due to the involvement of the ancient sages, but the otherworldly demons were clearly in a more advantageous position than the humans due to their superior strength. As a result, it had to be the humans who were in a passive position so far. They didn't think that the head of the Matthews clan would actually be able to turn the tables on the otherworldly demons as soon as he appeared.
You're Xavier Matthews, aren't you? Well, I'm Geo, and I'm willing to accept your challenge.
Before Xavier could return to the Pavilion of Warm Spring, a towering otherworldly demon suddenly walked out from the crowd. He was one of the remaining 6 Sempiternal Realm Consummation cultivators. Seeing that someone had taken the bait, Xavier asked with a smile, "What's your wager?"
I only have one Great Sage artifact. I can give it to you if I lose the duel. Well, in exchange, I won't ask you to give me the Celestial Amulet of Legacy if I win. All I want is to claim 3 slots to enter the Hall of Great Accomplishment,
Geo said. 3 slots? Xavier frowned in bewilderment. Based on the inscriptions that we found in the area, it seems like our Celestial Amulet of Legacy only allows us to bring 10 people into the Hall of Great Accomplishment, the sword said telepathically. I see. Xavier nodded contemplatively. Sure, I have no problem with that. I'll accept your wager. Even if Geo won the duel and obtained 3 slots to enter the Hall of Great Accomplishment, it would still be a highly disadvantageous situation for them. In a battle of 7 against 3, the Matthews clan should easily be able to overpower and kill those 3 unfortunate otherworldly demons tagging along with them. In any case, ancient sages weren't able to enter the Temple of Confucius, and they didn't have the power to interfere with the happenings inside.
I know those 5 are your tamed beasts, but they aren't a clear indication of your individual prowess. The one I'm challenging is you, not your beasts. As a master teacher, won't you cast aside your beasts and face me in a proper duel?
Geo asked. In other words, you don't want me to use my tamed beasts? Xavier asked as an unreadable smile crept onto his face.
That's right. I admit that your 5 beasts are formidable, but do you dare pit your true ability against me and fight me with your own strength, huh? Don't you think that it's dishonorable for a master teacher like you to be so reliant on your tamed beasts?
Geo taunted. I can face you without my tamed beasts, but since it's a handicap on my side, I want you to wager another Great Sage artifact, Xavier said.
You want me to wager another Great Sage artifact?
Geo frowned as he lowered his gaze in hesitation. After a moment of contemplation, he flicked his wrist, and a crimson spirit stone materialized in his palm.
I don't have any more Great Sage artifacts, but this sacred blood crystal is fueled using the blood essence of Sempiternal Realm Consummation beasts. It harnesses the full energy of an expert of that caliber. It'll be a convenient source of spiritual energy for your cultivation. While it can't compete with a true Great Sage artifact, its value should almost be on par with one. Will you take this as a replacement?
Xavier took a look at the crimson spirit stone, and he immediately sensed the concentrated spiritual energy that was emanating from the rock. It was so concentrated that it almost felt tangible. If he cultivated using it, he would indeed be able to advance his cultivation swiftly. Without a doubt, it was something that would be useful to him. Very well. I accept your deal. Xavier nodded in agreement. To be honest, he felt like he was hoarding a little too many Great Sage artifacts at this point. He didn't need any more of them. In terms of utility, the sacred blood crystal was definitely far more useful to him. Perhaps still a little worried about the matter, Geo declared loudly,
"The ancient sage of you humans and the ancient sage of my tribe will bear witness that the use of tamed beasts is forbidden in this duel."
Xavier didn't know where the ancient sages were hidden, but this declaration effectively meant that the rule had been officialized. Anyone who dared turn their back on this rule would be severely punished. This was because the ceasefire was of the utmost importance for both sides to preserve their fighting prowess for the fight over the Great Codex of Spring and Autumn later. While it was true that every single Sempiternal Realm Consummation cultivator was an invaluable addition to the team, the ancient sages wouldn't compromise the bigger picture just to protect a single one of them. Rest assured, since I've already agreed to your terms, you can expect me to honor my promise, Xavier replied confidently as he moved his tamed beasts into his myriad anti-FNAF.
"I'll believe in your honor as a master teacher."
Geo nodded. Taking a deep breath, he took a step forward and whipped out his weapon. It was a Great Sage tier Moonglaive. This was also the artifact that he was wagering on in the duel.
"Clanhead, be careful!"
one of the Grand Elders exclaimed worriedly. Without his tamed beasts, their clan head was only an Aureate body realm cultivator. It didn't seem possible for him to match an enemy 2 realms stronger than him. Was it really possible for one to breach such a huge disparity in strength? Xavier chuckled softly as he stepped forward. With a flick of his wrist, a jade-like root appeared in his palm. Now, I did say that I wouldn't use a tamed beast, and I'll honor that end of my promise. However, I don't have any formidable Great Sage artifact weapons, and this root is something that I've acquired out of coincidence. It's still decently resilient and hard to be used as a weapon. You shouldn't have any qualms with me using it in the battle, right?
"A root?"
Geo took a look at the item that the young man was holding in his hand, and only after confirming that it was indeed a root did he finally nod in agreement.
"Feel free to use it as your weapon."
As long as the young man didn't use his tamed beasts, it wouldn't matter much to him whether the young man used a Great Sage artifact or not. Besides, he had taken a closer look at the root and noticed nothing peculiar about it. "Oh, that's good. Little root, I'll leave the rest to you." Xavier nodded as he lazily tossed the root up into the air.
"Leave it to me,"
the root replied through the diffusion of its thoughts. After that, it flew into the aerial space right above Geo.
"Mere cheap street tricks,"
Geo spat coldly as he flung the Moonglaive in his grasp toward the root. The space tremored under Geo's movements. A Sempiternal Realm Consummation cultivator paired with a Great Sage artifact produced a might that would leave anyone trembling in fear. But before the Moonglaive could strike the root, the space around them suddenly jolted. The next instant, Geo found himself standing in the midst of a desert. A towering tree stood quietly in front of him. With a tug of a light breeze, buds of cotton slowly descended upon the ground like snow. Alarmed by the changes around him, Geo narrowed his eyes and shouted,
"What is this?"
Unbeknownst to him, wisps of nearly indiscernible cotton had fallen into his mouth as he spoke.
"What is going on?"
What kind of artifact is that? Not expecting a mere root to produce such a massive desert, everyone was stunned. For a moment, they weren't able to react at all.
Geo, it's just an illusion! You just have to find a way to break it!"
one of the experts of the otherworldly demonic tribe shouted.
"Yeah, all right,"
Geo said. However, before he could finish speaking, his body suddenly started convulsing wildly. The next instant, Geo was reduced to a pile of yellow sand. Not a trace of him remained. Silence immediately devoured the entire area. With a light sway of the towering tree, the desert suddenly vanished from sight. Everything reverted to normal, as if what they had just witnessed was nothing more than a figment of their imagination. The only difference was that the other world known as Geo had vanished completely from the face of the world.
Geo's died? His soul aura's completely vanished without a trace. Has his body really been reduced to yellow sand? How is this possible? What just happened?
The otherworldly demons were utterly horrified by what they had just witnessed. It was so inconceivable that they couldn't help but doubt the integrity of their eyes. In terms of fighting prowess, Geo could have been said to be the strongest among them all. Yet, despite his strength, he'd been reduced to yellow sand barely after the duel started. Just what in the world was that root? How could it wield such frightening prowess? The otherworldly demons were not the only ones appalled by this turn of events. The Sword Saint and the other Master Teachers watching the duel were dumbstruck as well. They had thought that Xavier would have a tough battle against Geo, especially since he'd been forbidden from using his tamed beasts. Who could have thought that he would end the battle with even greater ease than before? To end the battle in less than 2 breaths. Furthermore, it was not a simple death. Every single trace of Geo's existence had been completely erased.
Xav, with this...
St. Lana murmured worriedly.
Well, don't worry, it's nothing much.
It's just one of the minor fortuitous encounters that I told you about earlier. I happened to tame this root by chance, Xavier replied with a reassuring smile. As fearsome as the root appeared to be, it was actually extremely easy to defend against it. As long as one sealed one's acupoints and prevented its cotton from getting into one's body, the root would be rendered completely helpless against one. In terms of true fighting prowess, it was actually nowhere near the level of the 5 monarchs. St. Lana felt an ache in her chest.
Minor fortuitous encounter. 5 sempiternal realm consummation beasts, and a seedling that can easily eradicate a sempiternal realm consummation expert from the face of the world. Well, if they're considered minor fortuitous encounters, what do we count as then? Are we nothing at all?
Return. With a flick of his wrist, Xavier placed the root back into the myriad antive nest, following which he beckoned with his hand, and the sacred blood crystal and the moonglaive flew right into his grasp. Well, since I have won the duel, I won't be so formal, Xavier remarked. Without paying any heed to the response from the otherworldly demons, he threw those 2 artifacts right into his storage ring. Barely after he collected those items, a fearsome aura suddenly crept across the land as if a tornado was descending upon the world. Cracks appeared all over the ground, and the spring, summer, autumn, and winter pavilions began trembling non-stop. It felt as if they would succumb to the immense pressure at any moment.
This is the strength of an ancient sage.
Xavier narrowed his eyes as he hurriedly raised his head to take a look. However, the pressure seemed to be omnipresent, so he was unable to discern where it was coming from.
While that root isn't a beast, it does have its own life and consciousness. That should be enough for it to be deemed as a tamed beast. Yet you speak of a fair duel.
The domineering voice reverberated across the land, following which Xavier felt his body tensing on the spot. It felt like some formidable force had locked onto him, and it was threatening to crush him to death. His bones creaked as cold sweat poured down his head. It was apparent that the otherworldly demon ancient sage had deemed his actions an infringement of the rules and had decided to make a move. Old geezer Troy, didn't you hear my descendant asking if he could use the root earlier? Well, your subordinate clearly agreed to his terms. Are you intending to cause trouble just because your subordinate lost the duel? Well, if a fight is what you want, a fight is what you will get! Just as Xavier was about to reach his limits, a voice suddenly reverberated in the air, following which an energy reminiscent of a warm breeze in spring embraced his body, causing the pressure crushing him to vanish. It was just a simple clash between the 2 ancient sage experts, but the shock waves produced a crisp sound reminiscent of a river battering a boulder. It felt as if even the reinforced space in the Temple of Confucius would shatter from their strength. Well, the ancient sage of the Matthews clan. Knowing that the newly arrived ancient sage was on his side, Xavier heaved a sigh of relief. From the looks of it, the old ancestor of the Matthews clan had decided to make a move as well. The voice of the person named Old Geezer Troy echoed in the air.
Your descendant mentioned that the rune is hard and resilient, but he never revealed that it possesses such an enigmatic ability.
Since it was a duel, your subordinate should have known that there was a possibility that he would be killed. How naive must your subordinate have been to expect his enemy to come clean about his trump card? The old ancestor of the Matthews clan harumphed coldly. Besides, while the root does possess enigmatic abilities, the same could be said about your subordinate's moonglaive. A loss is a loss. If you don't have the courage to face the loss, you should have stopped your subordinate from accepting the duel. If you really want to exact vengeance for your subordinate, why don't you stop hiding like a damn tortoise and come out to face me? Even if I suffer some injuries while doing so, I swear that I will bust your nuts.
You!
Old Geezer Troy was so furious that his voice was quivering with rage. However, it seemed like he did fear the old ancestor of the Matthews clan quite a bit. Instead of fussing over the matter, he harumphed.
I'll overlook your provocations for today, but I don't believe you'll be able to constantly guard this fellow. His name is Xavier, isn't it? I'll remember it. I'll have plenty of opportunities to end his life once we're out of the Temple of Confucius. You useless bunch of fools! Stop staring with your mouths wide open! Return to the Pavilion of Irate Summer and wait patiently for the Hall of Great Accomplishment to open. Yes.
Hearing the order from their old ancestor, the otherworldly demons hurriedly turned around and returned to their pavilion. Hold it for a moment. Barely after the otherworldly demons started retreating toward the Pavilion of Irate Summer, they suddenly heard a loud bellow. It was from Xavier. Seeing that Xavier wasn't willing to let this matter rest, the faces of the otherworldly demons turned livid.
Do you still intend to duel with us?
Yeah, that's right. I still want to continue challenging you all. Rest assured, I won't use my tame beast or the root now. Is there still anyone brave enough to face me in a battle? Xavier had never been so good-tempered as to let someone who exerted pressure and threatened him get away without paying a hefty price. It was not as if he'd never killed an ancient sage before. An otherworldly demon couldn't help but ask skeptically, "Are you certain? If none of you have the guts to accept my duel even after I've given you so many concessions, I suggest that you return to the otherworldly battlefield and never appear on the Master Teacher continent ever again. With how cowardly you lot are, there's no way that you could ever become a threat to mankind." Xavier harumphed arrogantly.
You!
The otherworldly demons clenched their fists tightly upon hearing those words.
But are you really not going to use your tame beast and root?
Old Geezer Troy's voice echoed in the air. I'll swear in my capacity as a master teacher that I will rely only on my own strength and my weapon. Surely you won't be so frightened as to deprive a mere Oriate body realm cultivator of his weapon, right? Xavier raised his head proudly, devoid of the slightest fear toward old Geezer Troy. If you aren't going to allow me to use my weapon, just treat it as if I didn't say anything.
But use your weapon, then.
Old Geezer Troy harumphed coldly. His subordinate had also used his weapon earlier. Even if Xavier had a truly powerful weapon in his grasp, due to the limitations of his cultivation, there was only so much that he'd be able to do. Is there anyone who dares fight me? Xavier pointed his finger forward and challenged imposingly. If your subordinates are frightened, I don't mind having all of them coming at me. In other words, they can fight me one after another or fight me all at once. If I, Xavier Matthews, show even the slightest frown in response, I'll renounce myself as an offspring of the Matthews clan. Well said. You are indeed a man of our Matthews clan. The old ancestor of the Matthews clan complimented with a heartened tone. Following that, he harumphed coldly at the otherworldly demons. Old Geezer Troy, my descendants already made so many compromises. Surely you still can't be scared of him, can you?
You!
Not expecting to be humiliated by a mere Orient body realm cultivator, old geezer Troy was on the verge of exploding from rage.
Very well. I'll give you what you want. However, it won't just be a simple duel, but a life and death duel. In other words, the duel won't end until either this young brat dies, or my subordinates die. Do you still dare accept the challenge?
He had really lost his temper. Ever since he became an ancient sage, no one had dared talk down to him in such a manner. Yet a young brat actually dared to taunt him again and again. This was not something that his pride would allow. That young brat had powerful tamed beasts and a formidable root, but his cultivation was sorely lacking. That young brat might possess methods to deal with sempiternal realm cultivators, considering how he dared to make such a challenge in the first place. However, old geezer Troy refused to believe that none of his subordinates would be able to stop the young brat. Knowing that the other party was determined to use this opportunity to kill this descendant of his, the old ancestor of the Matthews clan harumphed coldly, "Old geezer Troy, you sure have the cheek to talk." Just as he was about to reject the request, another voice interrupted him. "Fine, I'll accept your challenge." Seeing how rashly Xavier had agreed to old geezer Troy's challenge, the old ancestor of the Matthews clan was horrified. "Have you thought this matter through?" he asked Xavier worriedly. "You won't be allowed to use your tamed beasts or the seedling. You'll only be able to use your own weapon. It's not too late to back down now." "I don't intend to back down, and I hope that the other party won't back down either," Xavier replied with an indomitable air. With a straightened back, he said, "Suppressing the otherworldly demons is part of my responsibility as a master teacher. Even if I'm no match for them, and all of this is nothing more than a futile sacrifice, I won't back down."
"Oh, well said,"
the old ancestor of the Matthews clan roared with hearty laughter.
"Put your mind at ease and focus your attention on eradicating these otherworldly demons. Since we've already agreed on the rules, that old geezer Troy won't dare renege on his promise and interfere in the duel. If he were to make such a move, he can be certain that he will have to face the rage of my soul." "I'll be glad as long as you don't renege on your promise,"
old geezer Troy sneered eerily in response.
"Has all of you ever heard? That young brat wants to challenge all of you, and you have the option of swarming him together if you want to. We of the Spirit Tribe have inherited the bloodline of the gods. We are unparalleled, and we cannot allow ourselves to be defeated by mere humans. If you lose in this battle, I don't think that there's any need for you to exist in this world anymore. On the other hand, if you successfully defeat him, I will bestow upon each of you a droplet of my blood." "A droplet of our Lord's blood? Lord, please rest assured we will not let you down."
Upon hearing the reward, the faces of the otherworldly demons flushed as bright light shone from their eyes.
"Let's begin then."
Shortly after those words were said, dozens of otherworldly demons immediately encircled Xavier, sealing all his escape routes.
"You!"
Not expecting the otherworldly demons to be so shameless as to really gang up on Xavier, the faces of the master teachers in the Pavilion of Warm Spring turned livid. "It's fine, I can handle them. There's no need to breach the rules over something as minor as this." Seeing that the master teachers intended to head forward to aid him, Xavier waved his hand and chuckled softly. After which he turned to the otherworldly demons and asked coldly, "We agreed earlier that I'm allowed to use my weapons, right?"
"Of course,"
old geezer Troy's voice echoed loudly. "Very well then, allow me to draw my weapon first before proceeding with the duel." Xavier nodded. He flicked his wrist, and the Dragonbone Divine Spear immediately materialized in his grasp. With a simple swing, it warped into a massive ancient dragon that soared through the air.
"That's a Sensation Arrow's Dragonbone Divine Spear! Really, this artifact! We know. That's not it. Those powers have been sealed, so I can only exert the sight of a great sage artifact at the moment, and this won't be sufficient to pose a threat to them.
Seeing the weapon that Xavier had taken out, old geezer Troy widened his eyes in astonishment before falling into deep contemplation. There was no doubt that the Dragonbone Divine Spear had been a formidable weapon at its peak, and even he would have to run as far as possible if he encountered it. However, it was a different matter now that its power had been sealed. Most of his subordinates had reached the sempiternal realm, and nearly all had a Great Sage artifact in their possession. This should at least be a match against the severely weakened Dragonbone Divine Spear. Old geezer Troy was confident that his subordinates would be able to stand their ground. But the next moment, the young man flicked his wrist and took out a gigantic sheet of metal. It was also a Great Sage artifact.
A Great Sage brick artifact? Furthermore, it seems to be forged out of golden origin spirit stone. Who in the world is so extravagant as to use golden origin spirit stone in such a wasteful manner?
Old geezer Troy frowned. However, that was not the end of it yet. In the blink of an eye, more weapons materialized in the surroundings, forming a defensive circle around Xavier. The infernal black saber, Thaddeus's spear, the soul theft shackle, ancient sage Ares inkstone. Each of Xavier's artifacts emanated a fearsome pressure reminiscent of sempiternal realm consummation experts.
How do you possess so many powerful artifacts?
Everyone had thought that the young man would only bring out a single Great Sage artifact to aid him in his battle. After all, each Great Sage artifact was an invaluable treasure. Yet who could have known he would bring out so many of them in the blink of an eye? Such extravagance had stunned everyone watching the scene. Putting aside the rarity and value of Great Sage artifacts, just taming a single Great Sage artifact could easily take several decades or even centuries of one's life. Yet a 20-year-old man had actually managed to tame so many of them. This was too unbelievable.
Attack!
Seeing as the number of Great Sage artifacts was growing by the second, the otherworldly demons realized that they could really lose against the young man at this rate. Thus, one of them immediately shouted the order for the group to launch their attack. "Hold it a moment, I haven't taken out all my artifacts yet," Xavier grumbled as he continued flicking his wrist. Another 4 Great Sage artifacts appeared. It was the Moonglaive and the other artifacts that he had won in the 2 earlier duels. Xavier's fingers danced agilely among them, tapping them accurately on certain points. The 4 Great Sage artifacts echoed in unison, indicating their submission to Xavier. They had all acknowledged him as their master. Following that, the 4 Great Sage artifacts rose into the air as well, directing their edges toward the otherworldly demons.
10 Great Sage artifacts! How is this a fair duel? Is this what he meant by even if I'm no match for them and all this is a fuel sacrifice, I won't break down?
Seeing the legion of Great Sage artifacts floating around Xavier, the otherworldly demons felt goosebumps rising on their skin. They could overlook a single artifact, but 10 of them? That was equivalent to facing 10 sempiternal realm consummation cultivators at once. Did they even stand a chance against such a powerful force? Thinking about the impassioned words of the young man earlier, like a lone hero fighting off hordes of enemies, they felt their hearts stifling up.
"You sacrifice my ass. The one who's in a disadvantageous position is clearly us. What are you waiting for? Are you waiting for your death?"
Old geezer Troy roared in a frenzy. As an ancient sage, he had lived for many years, yet he had never seen something as eerie as this.
"Yes!"
The longer they waited to strike, the more time Xavier would have to coordinate his artifacts together. If those artifacts were really able to coordinate with one another impeccably, they would stand no chance. Thus, they all charged forward furiously. The otherworldly demon who had roared the command to attack earlier was the first to charge forward and reach Xavier. The weapon that he wielded was a Great Sage Crescent Blade. He was one of the initial 6 sempiternal realm consummation experts, and in terms of strength, he was nearly on par with Scorpio. The tremendous strength that he boasted was brought out perfectly through his forceful weapon. With a simple hack, a deafening sonic boom echoed in the air, and even the surrounding space distorted slightly as a result of the force exerted. Xavier felt a tremendous might descending right upon his head. Just when it seemed he would be split in half, his time suddenly accelerated. He easily turned around to face the crescent blade before deftly tapping his fingers on it. An excited buzz sounded from the crescent blade, following which its massive body jolted ferociously and it escaped from the otherworldly demon's grip. It turned its blade against the otherworldly demon and swung itself down furiously. The eyes of the otherworldly demon widened in horror at this abrupt change. The next moment, his head plopped to the ground. Even before he died, he still had no idea what was going on.
Did he just tame that crescent blade?
The master teachers were dumbstruck by what they were seeing, and old geezer Troy looked utterly frenzied as well. To be able to tame their weapons and turn them against their masters in the midst of battle. How were they supposed to face an enemy like this? Before the crowd could recover from their shock, the young man had already charged into the crowd. Every weapon that came into contact with his fingers would immediately turn on its master. At the same time, the brick, the Dragonbone Divine Spear, and the other weapons were also collaborating closely with one another to destroy the otherworldly demons.
Initially, I thought that the otherworldly demons were going too far by ganging up on Master Xavier. But why does it seem as if it's Master Xavier who's the one bullying them? To actually snatch the enemy's weapons and turn them against their masters. I wonder how traumatized these otherworldly demons are. Well, there's no need to wonder about it. Well, it's definitely worse than whatever you can imagine. Well, it's no wonder Master Xavier challenged them all at once. Seems like he was prepared for this. Right from the start, he was already planning to slaughter all of the otherworldly demons.
Amid the discussions, Xavier had quietly backed out from the crowd. With his hands behind his back, he leisurely watched the massive battle between the otherworldly demons and his weapons. He couldn't help but remark, "I am deeply grateful for the gifts that you've all offered me. I will humbly accept them."
Really accept your head?
The otherworldly demons, who found themselves coming under the furious offense of their ex-weapons, were utterly frenzied. The pitiful plight that they were in made tears stream down their faces. Under the onslaught of weapons under Xavier's control, the otherworldly demons fell one after another. In the blink of an eye, over 30 of them had already been slain. Witnessing such a sight before him, the ancient sage named Old Geezer Troy finally came to the limits of his tolerance.
You're courted death!
His motive for having his subordinates challenge the human cultivators was to obtain the opportunity to enter the Hall of Great Accomplishment. However, with nearly all of his subordinates dead, what use did he have for the floss? It wasn't as if he could enter the Hall of Great Accomplishment himself. A massive hand suddenly materialized in the air, sealing the space surrounding the Hall of Great Accomplishment. An astounding might that seemed as if it could seal even the heavens rushed down from the sky, threatening to crush Xavier into mincemeat.
How powerful!
Realizing the danger heading his way, Xavier drove his gleam desperately, hoping to flee as far away as he could. However, he found his body completely bound in place. No matter how he struggled, he was unable to get away. Ancient sages were the most powerful existences on the Master-Teacher continent. Even the most resilient material in the world would be crushed under their imposing might. Given Xavier's cultivation, he stood no chance against such a force. Just as Xavier was nearing his limits, the cold glint of a sword suddenly flashed through the air. However, this sword glint wasn't aimed at the palm descending from the sky, and it did nothing to alleviate the tremendous pressure that Xavier was under. Instead, it was aimed at a void in space. The sound of a sword plunging right into flesh ripped through the air, following which fresh blood dripped from the void in space. It seemed like the old ancestor of the Matthews clan had been biding his time to determine Old Geezer Troy's exact location before making his move. Old Geezer Troy shrieked in anger. At the same time, the palm in the sky flickered a little before vanishing into thin air. Ripples diffused from a void in space. Old Geezer Troy knew that he was in a disadvantageous position at the moment, so he fled without any hesitation.
Oh, this story is exhilarating!
The old ancestor of the Matthews clan roared in hearty laughter. It was extremely difficult to kill a cultivator who had reached Ancient Sage. In truth, the two of them had fought with one another for many years, but there had been no conclusion to their battle. This time around, however, the old ancestor had managed to land a direct strike on Old Geezer Troy's vitals. While it was insufficient to take down Old Geezer Troy once and for all, the latter would have to recuperate for quite a period of time. The reason he was able to do it was because his descendant had managed to provoke Old Geezer Troy into losing his temper, leading him into making a reckless move. Lowering his head to look at the battlefield once more, he saw that all 30 of the powerful otherworldly demons had already collapsed as corpses. A huge array of weapons had fallen into Xavier's possession. They danced joyfully around him, as if concubines seeking imperial favor. "You might be young, but your capabilities and wisdom are remarkable."
Not bad,
the old ancestor of the Matthews clan said, following which a force slowly swept across the battlefield, gathering the blood droplets scattered over the ground. These crimson droplets converged together in the sky before being filled into a jade bottle. "It is due to you that I had the opportunity to severely wound Old Geezer Troy. As the senior of the Matthews clan, I cannot allow your contributions to go unnoticed. I will bestow these 5 droplets of ancient sage blood to you." "Thank you, old ancestor." Xavier accepted the jade bottle respectfully. To be honest, he had no idea what the blood of an ancient sage could be used for. However, the fact that it could drive the otherworldly demons into a frenzy, going to the extent of accepting his challenge despite the risks they would face, there was no doubt that it was an invaluable treasure. The blood of otherworldly demon ancient sages harnesses concentrated killing intent, so it might not be as useful to your cultivation. And besides, this is only your spoils of war, not my reward. As a senior, I can't be too stingy with my reward, so I will bestow this jade bottle to you as well. It contains 5 droplets of my blood. Use it well, and strive to advance your cultivation to higher realms as soon as possible. I believe that you'll be able to bring the Matthews clan to greater heights," the old ancestor of the Matthews clan said. Right after those words were spoken, a jade bottle materialized in the air. Even before it approached Xavier, he could already feel tremendous power pulsating within the blood droplets within the jade bottle, as if they could combust into flames at any moment. Even though Xavier's bloodline had already been stripped from him, considering that it was the blood of an ancient sage from the same clan within the jade bottle, it was likely to be of far greater use to him than the blood of an otherworldly demon ancient sage. "Xav, hurry up and thank our old ancestor," the sword reminded Xavier anxiously through telepathy. "Thank you, old ancestor." Xavier bowed deeply. "There's no need to be so formal. This is what you deserve," the old ancestor of the Matthews clan said. As the voice trailed to a halt, the imposing aura lingering in the air disappeared as if it had never been there in the first place. Knowing that the old ancestor had returned to hiding, Xavier heaved a sigh of relief. There was no doubt that many ancient sages would have made their way into the Temple of Confucius in hopes of acquiring Keith Cole's ultimate treasure. Given so, it would be best not to parade their strength around. After all, it was always the tree that stood out from the others that would fall in the face of a furious gale. If they unintentionally drew the ire of the other ancient sages, and the ancient sages chose to gang up on them, they would be dead before they knew it. Xavier sent a telepathic message over to the sword. "What is the use of the blood of an ancient sage?" "Every droplet of ancient sage blood possesses an incredible amount of energy," the sword explained with an excited gleam in his eyes. "Furthermore, it contains their comprehension of cultivation as an ancient sage as well. As such, If one could assimilate the blood of an ancient sage into one's body, one's cultivation would be able to improve by leaps and bounds, possibly reaching an unthinkable level. Assimilate? Well, that's right. For example, if a mortal came into contact with a droplet of ancient sage blood, and could successfully assimilate it without exploding from all the power raging within their body, they would be able to advance from fighter all the way to great sage at once, the sword explained. Xavier narrowed his eyes in shock. It had taken him so much time, effort, and resources in order to advance from fighter to great sage, and yet a mere droplet of ancient sage blood was more than enough to do the same. This was way too fearsome. Of course, he also understood that it was just an example, putting aside the fact that it was impossible for a mortal to assimilate the overwhelming power harnessed within the blood of an ancient sage. Even if they somehow found a way to pull it off, their gleam would be extremely bloated from achieving breakthroughs in such a forceful manner. As a result, their fighting prowess would be beneath that of an ordinary great sage, and it would be hard for them to push their cultivation further, considering their weak foundation. However, the true appeal of ancient sage blood lies not in the tremendous energy nor the comprehension of cultivation infused in it. What truly drives others frenzied over it is the power of the ancient sage's blood reincarnation that the blood harnesses. If a cultivator sustains severe damage, as long as their soul doesn't dissipate on the spot, a single droplet of ancient sage blood will allow them to make a complete recovery. Its effects are so powerful that even a head lopped off could be reattached once more as long as the cultivator hasn't breathed their last breath yet, the sword explained. Xavier froze. He couldn't even begin to describe his shock. Due to his Heaven's Path gleam, he possessed miraculous recovery abilities that allowed him to swiftly heal from most injuries. Nevertheless, if someone lopped his head off, there was no way that he would be able to recover from that kind of severe injury. Yet the blood of an ancient sage was able to heal such severe, near-death injuries. In other words, every droplet of ancient sage blood was no different from an additional life. It was no wonder the otherworldly demons had gotten so agitated over it. It was truly a priceless treasure. Father, I'll give you each one droplet. Well, it's unlikely that I'll use all 5 droplets here. Recovering from his shock, Xavier uncorked the cap of the jade bottle and flicked his finger. 2 droplets of blood pulsating richly with power flew toward the Sword Saint. It would be much better for him to give a droplet to each of his parents so that they would at least be able to protect themselves from harm. In any case, it was unlikely that he would use all 5 blood droplets here, so there was no harm in doing so. There were unpredictable dangers lurking in the Temple of Confucius, and it would set his mind at ease if his parents had such a life-preserving treasure with them. Not expecting their son to give them such an invaluable treasure without any hesitation, the Sword Saint exchanged glances with one another before clenching their fists tightly. With such a son, what more could they wish for in the world? Knowing that it was a show of filial piety from their son, the Sword Saint did not reject Xavier's gift and accepted the blood droplets from him. Despite the miniature sizes of the blood droplets, when they fell into the hands of the Sword Saint, they nearly dragged the duo down to the ground. This weight was not unique to just the blood of ancient sages. Even a single strand of hair of those who had reached ancient sage was as heavy as a mountain. If not for the Sword Saint's recent advancement in cultivation to sempiternal realm consummation, they might not have even been able to lift it up. Well, you should hurry up and assimilate it into your bodies, Xavier said with a smile. Without any hesitation, they sat down and each absorbed a blood droplet into their body, following which they slowly channeled it toward their aura. A short moment later, they abruptly opened their eyes. Have you succeeded? Xavier asked with a doubtful frown. How can it be that easy to assimilate the blood of an ancient sage? We've only stored it in our aura separately so that we can constantly wash our gleam. Well, over time, our gleam will be suffused with the aura of an ancient sage, and this will be highly beneficial to our cultivation, the sword said with a smile. If it was that easy to absorb ancient sage blood, it would truly be unworthy of its reputation as the ultimate treasure that countless cultivators sought. It was something that would require at least several years or decades of hard work. As such, they had chosen to store the blood droplet in their aura for the time being. By washing their gleam through it, they would be able to slowly assimilate it into their bodies. With sufficient time, the blood droplet would be completely suffused throughout their body, granting them the ability of blood reincarnation. I see. Xavier nodded in realization. I'll give it a try as well. After saying those words, he sat down on the floor of the pavilion. With a light tap of his finger, he absorbed a droplet of the ancient sage blood in the jade bottle into his body. As soon as the blood droplet entered his body, it fused right into it. Not only was there a complete lack of resistance, but he even felt the blood droplet pulsating joyfully through his body. It was almost as if it had finally returned to its place of origin. Xavier was utterly confused by the situation occurring in his body. Well, how have I assimilated the blood droplet just like that? They said that it would be a difficult process that required much time and effort, did they not? Why was it so easy for him? You've already assimilated. Hearing that his son had successfully assimilated the blood droplet into his body, the sword raised his head and directed a doubtful gaze over. Well, indeed. Xavier nodded as he swiftly elaborated on the happenings after the blood droplet entered his body. I think I understand, the sword said. It was 20 years ago, when our old ancestor incurred severe injuries. He needed the blood of a Matthews clan offspring in order to sustain his life. Well, back then, the only person in the Matthews clan whose bloodline purity met the mark was you. In other words, a portion of your blood flows through his body. Yeah, my blood flows in his body? Xavier's face twitched upon hearing those words. Somehow he couldn't help but find something really weird with those words. It was almost as if he had been reunited with his long-lost son. Ugh. Well, the primary reason we infused your blood into the old ancestor's body was to sustain his life, but the sheer purity of your bloodline induced an evolution in the old ancestor's constitution, thus further enhancing his fighting prowess. Well, as such, when you tried to absorb the blood of the old ancestor, it was as if that blood droplet was returning to its source. Well, naturally, it goes without saying that it would be much easier for you to assimilate blood droplets than us, the sword explained with a smile. I see. Xavier nodded as he decided not to think any deeper into the matter. He focused his attention on perceiving the ancient sage blood that he had assimilated into his body, and he found that it had fused impeccably with his own blood. Not only so, he found overflowing vitality sprouting in the depths of his body. It was truly a mysterious feeling. It was as if life itself was coursing through his body. If he had to put this feeling into words, it would be that even if someone snapped off his arm, he would be able to grow a new one the next instant. There was no need for him to worry about getting hurt anymore. However, he could sense that while there was an immense volume of vitality in his body, it was not infinite. It would deplete and run dry eventually. There was a pill known as the Grand Intermittent Pill that could allow a person's severed limbs to regrow, but its effects were far inferior to those of the ancient sage blood. Firstly, the Grand Intermittent Pill had minimal effectiveness on great sage cultivators due to the limited energy harnessed within it. Second, ancient sage blood was capable of reviving a person no matter how tattered their body was, even if their head was lopped off. On the other hand, the Grand Intermittent Pill would only grow a cultivator's severed limbs. If a cultivator's head was lopped off, no number of Grand Intermittent Pills would be able to heal them. I should give a droplet to Eva as well, Xavier thought with a smile as he placed the remaining 2 blood droplets into his storage ring. It was not easy to acquire such treasures, and he had no intention of keeping them to himself. He also had people whom he held dear and wanted to protect. As for the blood of the otherworldly demon ancient sage, I should find some time to see what I can do. Considering how his Heaven's Path gleam was able to emulate the gleam of the otherworldly demons, he might be able to use these blood droplets of the otherworldly demon ancient sage himself. But with so many master teachers around, this was definitely not the time or place to be experimenting with the blood droplets. He would just have to leave it for later on. Oh, right! You acquired news on Sarah. Where is she? Xavier stood up and looked at his parents. He was going to ask them about the matter concerning Sarah when the otherworldly demons suddenly came to challenge the sword, so there had been no time to inquire. Since the otherworldly demons had already been dealt with, it was time to get back to that.
There are 4 pavilions here. We're residing in the Pavilion of Warm Spring, and the otherworldly demons have dominated the Pavilion of Irate Summer. The beasts have swarmed the Pavilion of Cooling Autumn, and the Pavilion of Frozen Winter is being taken up by an unknown group of people. Prior to your arrival, I sensed a hint of cold aura coming from their group, so I took a closer look. For a split moment, I think I saw your student,
St. Lana said. St. Lana was hot-tempered at times, but she was extremely meticulous when it came to details. Considering that this was a matter that concerned her son, she'd been keeping a close eye on it. Even though the cold aura was indistinct, it had still caught her attention. So, there's a good chance that Sarah's in the Pavilion of Frozen Winter? Xavier asked. He hurriedly rose to his feet and walked to the windows to take a look. Of the 4 pavilions, spring corresponded to autumn, and summer corresponded to winter. From the Pavilion of Warm Spring, the Pavilion of Frozen Winter happened to be hidden by the other 2 pavilions, not allowing him to peer into the situation there.
However, I only took a quick glance before the other party disappeared back into the group. I thought that she resembled your student, but I was unable to confirm whether it's really her or not,
St. Lana said. I'll know once I head there to take a look, Xavier said imposingly. So long as there was a chance that Sarah could be in the Pavilion of Frozen Winter, it was his responsibility as her teacher to check the area out. Seeing that Xavier intended to head over, the sword hurriedly added, I'll follow you. I should at least be able to lend you a hand. It's fine. I can handle this on my own. Xavier shook his head and turned down the sword's offered help. In no way could the Sword Saint be considered weak, but the very fact that the other party had been able to kidnap Sarah and Gia discreetly likely meant that the other party was a formidable foe. Furthermore, he hadn't ascertained whether the kidnappers were truly an enemy or not. It would be much safer for him to head there alone. Knowing that his son possessed means far beyond him, the sword could only shake his head helplessly and instruct, Be careful. I will, Xavier replied, before swiftly making his way over to the Pavilion of Frozen Winter.
Intruder, please hold.
Before Xavier could even approach the Pavilion of Frozen Winter, he had already heard a voice, following which an overpowering pressure crushed down from the sky.
An ancient sage?
Xavier narrowed his eyes in shock. He had experienced such formidable might just a moment ago. It was a force that could only have been exerted by an ancient sage. It was unlikely that an ancient sage would easily make a move on him. More likely than not, the pressure served as a warning to remind him that the Pavilion of Frozen Winter was under the protection of an ancient sage as well. Of course, that was only to be expected. If those in the Pavilion of Frozen Winter didn't possess such strength, they would have been eliminated by the others already. There was no way that they would have been able to safely occupy a pavilion by themselves. Elder, I don't harbor any malicious intentions. I have a junior who's very likely within the Pavilion of Frozen Winter, and I just wish to enter to take a look. Xavier clasped his fist politely. Even though the old ancestor of the Matthews clan was likely in the vicinity as well, he didn't dare push his luck.
I know you. Xavier Matthews, 2 years old. The head of the 3 premier clans in the Sanctum of Sages. You single-handedly destroyed an army of 10,000 otherworldly demons strong in the subterranean gallery, sparing mankind from a catastrophe. Impressive, the ancient sage said.
Xavier was surprised by how the anonymous ancient sage was aware of his affairs. He clasped his fist and bowed. I'm unworthy of your praise.
Given your contributions to mankind, I would have welcomed your visit with the warmest hospitality from my side, if it had been on any other occasion. However, I'm afraid that I cannot permit you to enter the Pavilion of Frozen Winter at the moment, and I beg your pardon for that, the ancient sage said.
Why? Xavier frowned. As he pondered over the other party's words, a thought surfaced in his mind, and he asked, Elder, are you a master teacher? The other party didn't show the slightest hostility to him, despite knowing of his deeds in the subterranean gallery. Instead, the other party even labeled his deeds as contributions to mankind. Those were words that would only typically be spoken by Master Teachers. Could the other party be one of the ancient sages of the Master Teacher Pavilion headquarters? But if the other party was a Master Teacher as well, why was the other party stopping him from entering the Pavilion of Frozen Winter?
I am not from the Master Teacher Pavilion, but
The ancient sage began explaining, but before he could finish his words, a crisp echo suddenly sounded from the Pavilion of Frozen Winter as if some kind of seal had just been broken. Concentrated cold energy burst out from the broken seal into the surroundings, cloaking the Pavilion of Frozen Winter with a layer of frost in the blink of an eye. Sarah's indeed in there. Xavier's face darkened. It was the exact same cold energy that Sarah had emanated after he successfully altered her life energy path. There was no mistake. Paying no heed to the ancient sage, Xavier dove right into the Pavilion of Frozen Winter. It was apparent to him now that the other party was simply stalling for time to achieve their goals. So what if the enemy that he had to face was an ancient sage? If worst came to worst, he would just have to use his golden page and toss the Book of Heaven's path at the other party. For his students' safety, this was a price that he was willing to pay. Light flooded out from the Pavilion of Frozen Winter and formed a thin barrier around the building. Xavier rammed right into the barrier, but he found that he was unable to breach it with his current strength.
You cannot enter now,
the imposing voice of the ancient sage exclaimed. Scram! Xavier roared as he whipped out the Dragonbone Divine Spear and pierced it toward the light barrier. The attack of the Dragonbone Divine Spear caused the light barrier to waver a little, but the light barrier swiftly stabilized without the slightest scratch on it.
Great!
Unwilling to give up, Xavier infused all of his strength into the Dragonbone Divine Spear and thrust it toward the light barrier once more. This time around, however, bundles of black flames began emerging from the surface of the spear. Having undergone the trial of the Empyrean Heavenly Flame thrice, his body was already able to harness this devastating force of nature. Focusing all of the Empyrean Heavenly Flame that he had absorbed into the tip of the Dragonbone Divine Spear, it didn't take long for the light barrier to be set alight.
Empyrean Heavenly Flame!
The ancient sage hidden by the side was astonished. He was just about to raise his hand to extinguish the flames when the sound of a millstone scraping against the ground reverberated loudly in the air, following which the 4 pavilions began trembling simultaneously.
What's going on?
Knowing that something major had just happened, Xavier could only abandon his attempt to breach the light barrier in order to scan his surroundings. A loud explosion sounded from the towering hall of great accomplishment, and a crack opened between the tightly shut entrance gates. An aura of history poured forth from the depths of the hall of great accomplishment, suffusing the pavilions of warm spring, irate summer, cooling autumn, and frozen winter. In an instant, the crowd could vaguely see the passing of the seasons unfolding swiftly before their eyes. As the celestial amulet of legacy in the sword's hands came into contact with the aura of history, a warm glow burst forth from it, forming a light sphere that covered a diameter of 30 feet. Tugged by a compelling force, the Sword Saint and the others found their bodies being pulled uncontrollably toward the depths of the Hall of Great Accomplishment.
The Hall of Great Accomplishment has opened! Xav, let's go!
The Sword shouted anxiously.
I have to save Sarah first!
Xavier exclaimed anxiously as he turned his sights back to the Pavilion of Frozen Winter once more. Since he had finally found Sarah as her teacher, he was obliged to bring her back unharmed. Launching a barrage of stabs with the Dragonbone Divine Spear, it did not take long for the light barrier to be pushed to its limits and shatter under pressure. Xavier immediately made use of this opportunity to dash into the pavilion. However, just as he was making his way in, a light sphere formed of cold energy bolted out from the Pavilion of Frozen Winter. It followed closely behind the Sword Saint and the others, heading into the Hall of Great Accomplishment. Within the light barrier, Xavier noticed a slender figure shrouded in an icy aura. Who else could it be other than Sarah? The light sphere seemed to have been formed using her powers. The Sword Saint and the others were able to enter the Hall of Great Accomplishment successfully due to the Celestial Amulet of Legacy in their possession. However, the group that was in the light sphere constructed by Sarah was able to pass through the cracks in the entrance of the Hall of Great Accomplishment without any problem as well. Sarah! Seeing that Sarah had entered the Hall of Great Accomplishment, Xavier widened his eyes in panic. Following that, 20 beasts charged out of the Pavilion of Cooling Autumn and dashed straight toward the entrance of the Hall of Great Accomplishment. It seemed like they had intended to sneak into the subordinate hall in the midst of the chaos. However, just inches away from the Hall of Great Accomplishment, they found themselves being halted by an invisible barrier. No matter how they tried to push forward, they were not able to advance a single step forward. Most of these beasts were at Great Sage Level 3 and Level 4, but it was apparent that their strength was nothing in comparison to the barrier. It was almost as if they were termites trying to bring down a towering tree. Even if they pushed with all their might, the barrier would not waver in the least. Those scoundrels have entered the Hall of Great Accomplishment by making use of Sarah's unique constitution. Xavier nearly exploded from fury as realization struck him. How could he get so careless at a time like this? He should have known that the other party would make use of Sarah to enter the Hall of Great Accomplishment. Blinded by his anxiety to save Sarah, he ended up missing the opportunity to enter the Hall of Great Accomplishment together with his parents. Now that they had all entered the subordinate hall, he was the only one left outside. What the heck was that? This won't do. I must enter the Hall of Great Accomplishment as well. Xavier muttered anxiously as he charged furiously toward the entrance of the subordinate hall. It hadn't been easy for him to find his student once more. He would never forgive himself if he lost this chance to save her because of a careless mistake on his part. If worst came to worst, he would just make use of the Library of Heaven's Path to find the flaws in the barrier. Even if he had to tear the entire place down, he was determined to get in. In the blink of an eye, Xavier reached the invisible barrier. He had thought that he would be kept out just like the other beasts clawing desperately ahead of him, but contrary to his expectations, a warm glow suddenly embraced his body. Before he knew it, he was already on the other side of the barrier. Xavier was startled for a moment before realization struck him. How could I have forgotten about that? I have the Prime Amulet in my hands. Previously, Eva had told him that the Celestial Amulets of Legacy only worked against the subordinate halls they corresponded to, whereas the Prime Amulet granted entry to all of the subordinate halls and the Prime Hall. It was due to how useless Little Amulet had been in the Outer Dimensions that he had ended up forgetting about its existence. After all the disappointments that it had brought him, it was finally proving its value at a crucial time like this. Hauser, please bring us along with you! Before Xavier could charge all the way into the Hall of Great Accomplishment, he suddenly heard desperate voices behind him, so he turned around to take a look. They were from the beasts clawing frantically at the invisible barrier, but to no avail. Xavier gazed deeply at them for a moment before saying nonchalantly, "Become my tamed beasts, then I'll bring you in." Hearing those words, the beasts were stunned for a moment before a huge commotion broke out.
You want us to become your tamed beasts? You're dreaming. The reason we've the beast tribe cultivated so that we can live freely without deferring to anyone. Oh, you might be powerful, but there's no way you're going to make us submit to you. At the very most, we'll just give up on the opportunity to enter the Hall of Great Accomplishment. Or still be able to improve quickly by cultivating around the exterior of the Temple of Confucius. Anyway, even if I die here, I, the Burning Cloud Beast, will never submit to anyone.
The main reason that they had entered the Temple of Confucius was to find their own fortuitous encounters and advance their cultivation. However, if they had to submit to a human and lose their free will over it, they would rather give up on this rare opportunity. Hearing the words from the beasts, Xavier chuckled softly. With a flick of his spear, he crossed the invisible barrier once more, dashing right into the horde of beasts. 10 breaths later, he flicked his spear behind his back as he gazed quietly at the subdued beasts before him. Are you ready to submit now?
I respect the master.
The beasts swiftly got to their knees and bowed down to Xavier. The arrogant Verdant Cloud beast even took the lead in offering its blood essence to Xavier to seal a contract with him. The other beasts anxiously followed suit as well. It was as if they were all afraid that their new master wouldn't recognize them if they were too late in professing their submission. The old ancestor of the Matthews clan and the anonymous ancient sage were speechless. When did those of the beast tribe become so subservient? Even they as ancient sages wouldn't be able to force those of the beast tribe to do anything against their will. Otherwise, any ancient sage would have been able to easily form an army of great sage beasts. Yet this young man actually managed to do it within seconds. In an instant, all the experts who were unable to enter the Hall of Great Accomplishment found themselves dumbstruck. Let's enter. With all the beasts pledging their loyalty to him, Xavier nodded in satisfaction. He moved all of the beasts into the myriad Antive nest before making his way through the invisible barrier once more. But things didn't go as he had expected this time around. He found himself colliding with the invisible barrier that had halted the footsteps of the beasts. Unlike before, he was not able to pass through it. What's going on? Xavier's lips twitched at this unexpected situation. Could it be that he waited too long and was no longer able to enter the Hall of Great Accomplishment? If that was really the case, he might just burst into tears on the spot. Master, you're bringing in too many beasts with you. Just as Xavier was trying to make sense of the bizarre situation before him, little Amulet's voice sounded in his head. Normal celestial amulets of legacy can bring 10 people in. As the Prime Amulet, I can bring 15 people in. However, you tamed over 20 beasts earlier. Hearing those words, Xavier heaved a sigh of relief. Fortunately, it was not that he couldn't enter the Hall of Great Accomplishment anymore, but that he had exceeded the load capacity. He sent a telepathic message to Little Amulet and asked, "Won't it work if I place them in a folded space?" "It won't work, otherwise your parents would have been able to bring everyone into the subordinate hall," Little Amulet explained. "I see." Xavier nodded in comprehension. There was no way that Keith Cole would have allowed the rules that he had imposed on the subordinate halls to be circumvented that easily. Otherwise, there would be no point in setting those restrictions in the first place. Thus, Xavier released the beasts whose cultivation was lower, till there were only 14 of them left. He tried walking through the invisible barrier once more, and this time he was able to pass through it without any issues. Shortly after passing through the light barrier, Xavier suddenly said, "Wait a moment, that isn't right. The Heavenwood Green Serpent is in my folded space as well. If we factor him and his subordinates in, doesn't that mean that the number of people I have with me has already exceeded 15? The 14 beasts only included those that he had just tamed a moment ago. Other than them, he also had the Heavenwood Green Serpent, Gold Spirit Cloud Tiger, Crimson Franz White Tiger, and so on in the myriad Antive nest. Thus, the total number of beasts he had with him was, in fact, more than 20. As for all the other tamed beasts and entities that he had living within the myriad Antive nest over his journey, he had let them go prior to entering the Temple of Confucius. Oh, they're considered native life forms to the Temple of Confucius, so they're allowed to pass freely through the barriers in it. As such, they're not counted in the quota," Little Amulet explained. "Wow, there's such a thing as well?" Xavier asked in astonishment, not expecting there to be such an exception to the beasts in the Temple of Confucius. Shaking his head, he hastened his footsteps and swiftly advanced into the Hall of Great Accomplishment. It had been over a minute since the others had entered the area, so he would have to up his speed in order to catch up with them. Passing through the massive gates, he found himself standing in the midst of a humongous hall. Sculptures of many different demeanors and postures were placed neatly on both sides. Some were in deep thought, some were looking into the distance, some were reading a book, some were in the midst of their cultivation. They were sculpted so lifelike that it seemed almost as if they could come alive at any moment. Are these the 72 sages? It didn't take long for Xavier to recognize the models behind those sculptures. They were none other than the 72 sages under Keith Cole's lineage. Keith Cole was known to have had over 3,000 students and 72 direct disciples. His 72 direct disciples were known as the 72 sages, and the strongest 10 of them, which included Ancient Sage Meryl and Ancient Sage Kirin, were respectfully referred to as the 10 Apostles. Each of the 72 sages had their fair share of legendary exploits, achieving astounding accomplishments in their lifetime. Their deeds had been recorded by the Master Teacher Pavilion in the form of literature and artwork to remind the world of their greatness and the sacrifices that they had made for mankind. Xavier had once seen some of their artwork, so it wasn't too difficult for him to recognize the sculptures. Looking at those ancient figures, he could almost see the devastating battles against the otherworldly demons back in their era. Without their support, there was no way that Keith Cole could have quelled the threat of the otherworldly demonic tribe single-handedly back then. They were the cornerstones of mankind's swift development over the years. In that era of despair, their existences were symbols of hope to mankind. Even after the passing of tens of thousands of years, their names remained unforgotten by the world. Xavier solemnly bowed to them to express his deepest respect to these great figures before moving on. The sculptures of the 72 sages emanated slight pressure on those walking past them, tempering one's state of mind and soul. Without a doubt, this was extremely beneficial for the advancement of one's soul depth. After taking a few more steps, Xavier saw a few master teachers sitting cross-legged on the floor, unable to advance further. They were the Grand Elders of the Matthews clan. Due to the limitations of their soul depth, it was likely that they would incur severe injuries if they forced themselves to advance. Since that was the case, it would be wiser for them to make use of this pressure to swiftly raise their soul depth. Seeing that they were deep in concentration, Xavier chose to pass them by without disturbing. Till that moment, he still wasn't too sure who the culprits who kidnapped Sarah and the others were. However, the fact that they were able to pass through the hallway consisting of the sculptures of the 72 sages meant that their soul depth didn't pale in comparison to his. With such high soul depth, it was likely that their cultivation had reached the sempiternal realm consummation. If that was the case, they would pose a major threat to his parents and the other members of the Matthews clan. Coming to the end of the hallway, Xavier found himself arriving before a grand hall. His parents and the other Grand Elders of the Matthews clan were standing in the middle of the hall, and opposite them were 8 youths who emanated imposing auras. Just as he had guessed, all of those 8 youths were sempiternal realm consummation experts. Seeing that his parents were fine, Xavier heaved a sigh of relief, after which he turned his gaze to the 8 youths. A young woman stood at the center of the crowd. Her eyes were tightly shut, and surges of cold energy were flowing out her body. It seemed like she was trying to activate some seal on a wall in the hall. Xavier's eyebrows shot up, and he exclaimed anxiously, "Sarah!" He hurriedly started to rush over toward her. "Xav, it doesn't seem like she's able to hear our voices." Before he could reach Sarah, the Sword Saint quickly sent a telepathic message to inform him. "She can't hear our voices." Xavier was taken aback. "We tried calling for her earlier, but there was no response from her. She didn't even turn her head around as if she couldn't hear us at all," the Sword replied. "She must be too engrossed in deciphering the painting on the wall. We can't really tell what her purpose for doing so is," St. Lana said as she secretly pointed toward the wall. "Painting?" Tracing St. Lana's finger, Xavier finally noticed the massive painting on the wall. The painting was of remarkable verisimilitude, as if an entire world was sealed within it. Sarah was continuously channeling her cold energy into the painting, seemingly trying to undo the seal cast on it. Normally, Sarah should have noticed his presence as soon as he stepped the hall, not to mention that he had even called for her. The fact that she wasn't reacting at all likely meant that she was in a trance. Seeing that Sarah was unharmed, Xavier heaved a sigh of relief, and his unnerved heart finally settled down, time being. He turned his attention to the 8 youths standing opposite them and narrowed his eyes. "Who are they?" "Well, I asked them earlier, and they said that they're the offspring of the 100 schools of philosophers," the Sword said. 100 schools of philosophers? Xavier frowned. "But they're the descendants of the 72 sages, right? Why did they kidnap Sarah, and what's that painting on the wall?" All along, he had thought that it was the otherworldly demonic tribe who had captured Sarah, Gia, and Al. Considering the callous nature of the otherworldly demons, it was completely within their nature to pull off something like this. Yet who would have thought that the culprits were really from the 100 schools of philosophers? While he had stumbled upon some clues that pointed to the 100 schools of philosophers, he still had some reservations about suspecting them. After all, their lineage originated from Keith Cole, who held principles and propriety in high regard. It was hard to believe that they would commit something as impetuous as kidnapping a person to achieve their own goals. This did not fit the common perception of the 100 schools of philosophers. Not only that, what was even more bizarre was that these offspring of the 100 schools of philosophers were actually more interested in a painting than the sculptures of their ancestors outside. Could it be that some kind of incredible secret was hidden within the painting? Harboring such thoughts in his mind, Xavier couldn't help but take a closer look at the painting before him. The first thing he noticed was the antiquated aura emanated by the painting. It felt like an artifact that had survived through history. He activated his Eye of Insight in an attempt to take a closer look at it, but he found that the painting seemed to have fused perfectly together with the time and space of the hall, thus obscuring it from his view. This was probably the seal that Sarah was trying to break. Nevertheless, he could still feel an air of grandeur coming from the painting. It seemed as if one's consciousness would be absorbed into the painting with just a single look. The sword's voice suddenly sounded in Xavier's ears. "Is it possible for this to be the Great Codex of Spring and Autumn?" Great Codex of Spring and Autumn? Xavier's eyebrows shot up. Well, the Great Codex of Spring and Autumn is said to be the strongest artifact that Keith Cole left behind. But there are those that say that it's a book, there are those that say that it's a weapon, and there are also those that say that it's a spatial artifact. Well, in any case, no one's ever seen the true form of Great Codex of Spring and Autumn before. So, wouldn't it be possible for it to be a painting? The sword analyzed. Well, otherwise, why would the experts of the 100 schools of philosophers rush right here as soon as the Hall of Great Accomplishment opens in order to decipher the seal? Furthermore, it's apparent that they're aware that Sarah's strength is crucial to deciphering the seal, which explains why they kidnapped her. Hearing those words, Xavier fell into deep thought. There was some sense to what the sword was saying. Most information available about the Temple of Confucius came from rumor, so it might not necessarily be true. While the name Great Codex of Spring and Autumn suggested that the artifact existed as a book, the artifact might be able to assume multiple forms. This was similar to how the Dragonbone Divine Spear was able to alternate between the form of a spear, a belt, and a skeletal dragon. Xavier turned his gaze back to the magnificent painting on the wall and scrutinized it closely through the Eye of Insight. While its contents were a little obscure due to the seal, he was still able to make out the scenery of a barren snowfield. It seemed like a world of permafrost lay on the other side of paint. There are temporal laws infused with painting. By examining the painting carefully, he could feel the power of space and time infused within it. The flow of time within the painting was likely different from that of the real world. If a separate concept, time, existed within the painting, could the paint really be the Great Codex of Spring and Autumn? If that was the case, he would have to snatch the painting regardless of cost. Even if the other party was the 100 schools of philosophers, he would not pull his punches. An idea suddenly flashed through Xavier's mind. Even though I might not recognize the Great Codex of Spring and Autumn, Little Amulet should be able to discern it. He was lacking in knowledge concerning the ancient era, but Little Amulet was different. It had specially been forged by Keith Cole to serve as the key into the Temple of Confucius, so it should be able to recognize the Great Codex of Spring and Autumn. Thus, he sent a telepathic message to Little Amulet to ask about the matter. Great Codex of Spring and Autumn! That's the most ludicrous thing I've ever heard in my life! Oh, that's the canvas of 4 seasons which Keith Cole drew personally! Little Amulet replied amid guffaws in the Myriad Antive Nest. There was a light breeze in the Myriad Antive Nest which caused Little Amulet to flutter. Canvas of 4 seasons? Didn't you notice the 4 pavilions prior to entering the Hall of Great Accomplishment, huh? Spring, summer, autumn, and winter. Those are the 4 seasons of the world, Little Amulet explained. Xavier pondered for a moment before nodding in agreement. Thinking back, Keith Cole's superior breakthrough method to Great Sage also involved conceptualizing one's body as the world to emulate the 4 seasons of nature. He had thought that it was on a whim that those pavilions were named after the seasons, but it seemed like there was more to it. What's the use of the canvas of 4 seasons that those of the 100 schools of philosophers would go to such lengths for it? While Xavier was slightly disappointed to learn that the painting was not the Great Codex of Spring and Autumn, he was undoubtedly intrigued by it. Even if it was not the Great Codex of Spring and Autumn, it was likely a formidable artifact of some sort. It wouldn't have caught the attention of the 100 schools of philosophers otherwise.
The canvas of 4 seasons harnesses the concept of the 4 seasons, spring, summer, autumn, and winter, allowing one to use the forces of nature to temper oneself,
Little Amulet replied.
On top of that, time flows faster within the painting compared to the external world, roughly around 2-fold. In other words, a cultivator who cultivates for 2 years in the painting would find that only 1 year has passed in the real world. As such, it is the ideal artifact to train aspiring talents.
Xavier nodded in agreement. The reason that the Matthews clan had been able to remain the #1 Sage clan even after the passing of so many years could mostly be credited to its blood reservoir. Utilizing the difference in the flow of time, the offspring of the Matthews clan were able to comprehend secret arts and master occupations much faster than their counterparts. The same went for the Master Teacher Pavilion headquarters. Of course, the pointers of 9-star Master Teachers were invaluable in reducing the detours in one's cultivation, but more than that, the difference in the flow of time in the Hall of Spring and Autumn ensured the Master Teacher Pavilion headquarters would have powerful experts in every generation. In fact, it was largely due to cultivating in the Hall of Spring and Autumn that Seth had been able to advance his cultivation far faster than the rest of his students. Given how the canvas of 4 seasons allowed one to cultivate for 2 years within the span of 1 year, it could be considered a decently powerful art.
However, based on what I know, what's truly valuable about the canvas of 4 seasons isn't the difference in the flow of time, but that Keith Cole has sealed a fragmented piece of the world within it,
Little Amulet added excitedly. Sealed a piece of the world? Xavier contemplated for a moment before nodding in agreement. I see. Well, considering how the cycle of seasons in the painting is still persisting to this day, I suppose that it is to be expected that it contains a fragmented piece of the world. There were several tiers to folded spaces. The most ordinary folded space involved creating a dimension suitable for storing objects, but was insufficient to sustain life. An example of that would be storage rings. Folded spaces that were a tier higher could be viewed as greenhouses. It was possible to create conditions capable of sustaining life in these folded spaces, but they were highly dependent on external inputs in order to maintain these conditions. If one persistently neglected to supply spiritual energy to these folded spaces, their conditions would gradually deteriorate to the point that it would be hard to sustain life. Xavier's myriad Antifnest was at such a tier. He had to supply his spiritual energy into it in order to ensure that it developed positively. This was different from the Master Teacher Continent, which was able to produce its own spiritual energy and breathe new life dynamic. The fact that the painting was able to emulate the cycle of the 4 seasons likely meant that it was a space similar to that of the forest dimension. It could produce its own spiritual energy to support life, which placed it at a higher tier than his myriad Antifnest. Considering the strength that Keith Cole had wielded, his ability to seal a fragmented piece of the world into his painting wasn't surprising.
It's to be expected, but you don't seem to understand the significance behind this. The fragmented piece of the world infused into the painting is not the same as the world you see before you right now,
Little Amulet explained.
It's a fragmented piece of the ancient world.
A fragmented piece of the ancient world? Is there anything different about it? At the very most, won't the difference simply lie in the concentration of spiritual energy? And Xavier didn't think too highly of the matter. It was likely that the concentration of spiritual energy had been much higher in the ancient era, considering how the world was able to support the rise of Keith Cole, the 72 sages, and so many other powerful experts. However, what about it? Even if Keith Cole had sealed a fragmented piece of the ancient world into the full space, it was ultimately just a fragmented piece. It couldn't be compared to the vast lands of the current Master Teacher Continent. Before Xavier could finish his sentence, his eyes suddenly narrowed as a thought rose from the depths of his mind. No, that's not all. You're saying that the fragmented piece of the world sealed within the painting comes from tens of thousands of years ago, well, back in the era when cultivators were still able to advance to ancient sage. So, if one were to cultivate within the canvas of 4 seasons, there's a chance that one can actually achieve a breakthrough to ancient sage, right? Master K and the Sword had shared several pieces of information with him regarding ancient sages. Around 10,000 years ago, a certain quality seemed to have vanished from the atmosphere of the world. Without this quality, the many sempiternal realm consummation experts of the world found themselves unable to take the final step forward to reach ancient sage. It was due to this change that human ancient sages willingly went into hibernation in order to prolong their lifespan as much as possible to protect mankind from the otherworldly demonic tribe. Considering that this quality had gone missing in the last 10,000 years, if the fragmented piece of land that Keith Cole had sealed within the canvas of 4 seasons was truly from his era, did that not mean that it would harness the quality required for one to achieve a breakthrough to ancient sage too?
That's right. Why else do you think they would go so far for this painting?
Little Amulet nodded smugly in agreement.
I see. This painting represents an opportunity to achieve a breakthrough to ancient sage. But since that's the case, I should give it my all to acquire it.
Xavier nodded determinedly. Given his rate of cultivation, while he was only at Aureate Body Realm consummation, it was likely that he would be knocking on the bottleneck of ancient sage soon enough. If he couldn't advance any further than that, it would truly be torture for him. Since the opportunity was right in front of him, he had to seize it by hook or by crook.
Thanks for your reminder, little Amulet. You aren't as useless as you seem after all.
Xavier burst into hearty laughter. If not for little Amulet explaining the significance of the canvas of 4 seasons to him, it might have slipped right through his fingers. On the other hand, the Sword stared speechlessly at his son, who had abruptly broken out into huge peals of laughter amid the tense silence between both sides. Had his son lost his mind? As Xavier and little Amulet had communicated through Gleam telepathy, the Sword was unaware of their interaction. He thought it was because he had said that the painting could be the great codex of spring and autumn that his son had suddenly gotten so excited. However, to only start laughing after several minutes had passed. His reaction speed was a little slow.
What? Xav!
Seeing how his son's laughter didn't stop even after some time, the Sword couldn't help but call to him out of worry. Xavier quickly recovered from his laughter and nodded.
No matter what, we have to get that painting.
He might have still been a distance away from ancient sage, but his parents were already at the sempiternal realm consummation. They were ready to take the final step forward at any moment. If they could acquire the painting and successfully achieve a breakthrough to ancient sage, there would be very little for him to worry about for the rest of their journey through the Temple of Confucius.
Very well.
Hearing the words of their son, the Sword Saint nodded. While they were chatting telepathically, the seal on the canvas of 4 seasons was starting to waver under Sarah's ceaseless attacks. It seemed as if it would break open at any moment.
Very soon.
Upon seeing this sight, the eyes of the 8 youths lit up in anticipation. While everyone was waiting expectantly for the seal to be undone so that they could take the painting away with them, the sound of something shattering apart suddenly broke the silence of the hall. Astonished by this abrupt noise, the crowd quickly turned their gazes over, and to their horror, the frozen river depicted in the painting had actually begun melting.
This is bad. We need to hurry up. Once spring arrives in the painting, we won't be able to do the seal with cold energy anymore.
One of the 8 youths exclaimed. He quickly rushed to Sarah's back and channeled his gleam into her body, providing her with the extra energy required to decipher the seal as quickly as possible. The others also realized the urgency of the matter, so they quickly rushed over and channeled their gleam into Sarah's body through a secret art. In an instant, the surge of cold energy exerted by Sarah intensified, hastening the rate at which the seal was being undone. Spring arrives in the painting. Knowing that little Amulet was knowledgeable about the issue, Xavier quickly asked, "Wait, does that mean to say that the seal is interrelated with the current season depicted in the painting?"
As the canvas of 4 seasons moves from one season to the next, the seal also has to alter accordingly in order to seal the energy in the painting and ensure that it doesn't leak out, Little Amulet explained. I reckon that these fellows from the 100 Schools of Philosophers calculated that it would be winter in the canvas of 4 seasons at the moment, so they kidnapped your student to decipher the seal. The seal takes on the cold attribute when it's winter in the painting, allowing those who possess the pure feminine constitution to easily manipulate and decipher the seal. However, once spring settles in, the seal will change accordingly. If they don't have a corresponding power, it'll be impossible for them to continue deciphering the seal anymore.
Judging by how the glaciers are melting and rivers are starting to flow once more, the canvas of 4 seasons has already started progressing from winter to spring. Should I help them decipher the seal? Xavier asked. To be honest, he had no idea what kind of energy would correspond to the spring seal. If he didn't lend a hand to the 100 Schools of Philosophers now, there was a good chance that there wouldn't even be a painting for them to fight over. If that was the case, he might as well help them for the time being and battle with them over the ownership of the painting afterward. In any case, he had the 5 monarchs, more than a dozen tamed beasts, and many great sage artifacts in his possession. No matter how powerful the 8 youths from the 100 Schools of Philosophers were, he didn't think that they would be a match for him.
Do you think that it's a sheer coincidence that you arrived at the Hall of Great Accomplishment after breaking out of what you called the Ice Dimension? Little Amulet harumphed.
Xavier was first taken aback for a while before his eyes lit up in comprehension. The canvas of 4 seasons is in its winter season at the moment, and the Ice Dimension is filled with frost as well. Well, if there's a connection between the two of them, could it mean that... Having thought it through, Xavier flicked his wrist, and the icy crystal that had been placed on the otherworldly demonic tribe's altar materialized in his grasp. The icy crystal was no longer as cold as it had been previously. On the contrary, he felt warmth and nourishment in the crystal, as if life was finally returning to the world after a long period of frost. Reminiscent of the painting before him, the energy in the icy crystal was gradually progressing towards spring. I see, Xavier nodded in realization. He had been addressing that 3rd dimension that he'd entered as the ice dimension all this time, but that was not an accurate term. To be more precise, it should have been called the dimension of 4 seasons. The season in there wasn't limited to winter. It would cycle between spring, summer, autumn, and winter. It just so happened that it was winter when he entered the dimension, which was why all he could see was snow. The artifact that was controlling the weather in the dimension of 4 seasons was the crystal that he was holding on to. Had he not taken it away, the snow in that dimension would have started melting, thus ushering spring back into that world.
That crystal in your hand is the crux to breaking open the seal, Little Amulet said.
Seeing that it was just as he had guessed, Xavier nodded. Then, with a slightly doubtful voice, he asked, I thought you didn't know anything at all. Why are you suddenly so knowledgeable about all of this? From the forest dimension all the way to the dimension of 4 seasons, Little Amulet had been completely useless. Yet at that moment it was speaking with absolute confidence. If it had known all this information from the very start, why did it not say so? Little Amulet pondered for a moment before proudly replying, It might be because Keith Cole sealed my memories in a manner such that I only regain the relevant memories when I enter specific places. Unless I enter a hall itself, I'll be completely ignorant to whatever's in it. For example, if you ask me about what's in the other 5 subordinate halls, I wouldn't be able to tell you anything.
All right, then.
Xavier sighed helplessly. He could see why Keith Cole would impose such a restriction on the Prime Amulet. Otherwise, all of his heritage and treasures would have been swept away by a single person, and that was unlikely what Keith Cole wanted. With this crystal, I should be able to decipher the canvas of 4 seasons seal as and when I like. Well, since that's the case. Realizing that he was in an advantageous position instead because he had entered the dimension of 4 seasons, Xavier shot a glance at the 100 Schools of Philosophers, who were desperately trying to release the seal within the limited time that they had, and a smile crept onto his face. The 8 youths were standing in a straight line behind Sarah, connected to each other palms to backs. They had channeled all of their gleam into Sarah's body, supplying her with sufficient energy to exert a steady surge of cold energy toward the seal. Since you had the guts to kidnap Sarah and put her in a trance to do your bidding, I don't think that you can blame me for what I'm going to do next. Xavier muttered under his breath. Chuckling softly, he calculated his timing carefully before dashing forward swiftly as though a bolt of lightning. His movements were extremely swift, and he had even ignited his Matthews clan bloodline for this. As such, before anyone could even react, he was already right above Sarah. Sever! Without any hesitation, Xavier flicked his finger and sent a surge of sword energy to sever the contact between the forefront palm and Sarah's back. As the contact was severed before the 8 youths could retract their gleam from Sarah's body, the resulting effect was no different from the 8 youths donating their energy to Sarah. Under the guidance of Xavier's gleam, the huge influx of energy within Sarah's body swiftly tore through all of the bottlenecks in her cultivation, causing her strength to surge furiously. In just 2 breaths, she had already reached Sempiternal Realm consummation. Tita! The rise in her cultivation seemed to have broken whatever mind-controlled technique was placed on Sarah. She swiftly regained her consciousness, and upon seeing Xavier's figure above her, her eyes lit up. Seal the remaining gleam in your body away for the time being. You can use it when you're pushing for a breakthrough to Ancient Sage, Xavier instructed as he sent the method to seal the huge bundle of energy to her. Even with the furious surge in Sarah's cultivation all the way to Sempiternal Realm consummation, she still had a tremendous amount of energy lingering in her body. After all, in her body was the full gleam of 8 Sempiternal Realm consummation experts. Xavier was thinking of having Sarah seal it away for the time being and use it in the future when she attempted a breakthrough to Ancient Sage. Otherwise, it would be a pity to allow such precious energy to go to waste. Not expecting their gleam to suddenly be stolen in such a manner, the 8 youths exploded in rage. Xavier, you are courting death! Courting death. Look who's speaking here. Floating in the air, Xavier glared down at the 8 youths beneath him with utterly cold eyes. You kidnapped my student and limited her freedom. With no regard to her will, you forced her to expend her strength to help you decipher the seal on the painting. Is this the kind of propriety that the 100 schools of philosophers abide by? Is this what you inherited from Keith Cole? The final shred of goodwill that Xavier harbored toward the 100 schools of philosophers had vanished by that point. Not only did they go around forcing the Natalie clan and the Matthews clan to accept their challenges to acquire the Celestial Amulets of Legacy, but they even captured his students and collaborated together with the otherworldly demonic tribe. It seemed like they had already lost sight of what they stood for at the very start. We're doing this for mankind! One of the youths in the group shouted angrily. For mankind? Oh, what a coincidence! What I'm going to do right now is for mankind as well. Get them, Xavier replied with a cold sneer. Knowing that it was meaningless to argue with the other party, he flicked his wrist. The 5 monarchs and countless weapons materialized around the area and charged for the 8 youths from the 100 schools of philosophers. Why, this is you! The 8 youths didn't think that Xavier would make a move on them without any hesitation. They were angered by his actions, but given the current situation, they had no choice but to focus their effort on fending off the incoming enemies. Teacher! Seeing that her teacher was confronting the youths from the 100 schools of philosophers directly, worry rippled in the depths of Sarah's eyes. Don't worry, I'm not so weak as to be done by them. Tell me how you were kidnapped by them and what happened afterward. I'll redress your grievances, Xavier said. This was what happened. Sarah began to recount her story. During her time at the Empire Alliance City, she ordered the members of the Glacier Plain Court to return to the city of Glacier, while she remained in the Empire Alliance for a period of time to reinforce her cultivation. Gia also stayed behind to protect her during her cultivating. Thinking that there would be few who were able to pose a threat to the two of them, Xavier didn't think much about it and returned to the Matthews clan. But just when the two of them were finally about to leave Empire Alliance City, they encountered a young man. The young man did not make a move on them right away. Instead, he informed them that he was from the 100 schools of philosophers, and there was something important that he needed their help with. However, due to certain confidentiality issues, he couldn't tell them what it was yet. Naturally, the two of them couldn't possibly accept such a questionable request. Thus, they ended up battling with one another, and they swiftly found themselves being outmatched and captured. By the time they realized that they were in a dire situation, it was already too late for them to send out any help messages. After that, they were confined in a solitary location. However, the other party did not mistreat them. Instead, they supplied them with sufficient cultivation resources to further their cultivation, and there were even experts who helped them with the difficulties that they were facing with their cultivation. On top of that, they imparted the method to decipher the seal to them. As for the reason that Sarah had been in a trance earlier, it was actually in order to protect her. The seal on the canvas of 4 seasons was extremely powerful, and it would inflict tremendous pressure on one's mind while trying to decipher it. By placing her in a trance, the chances of her losing concentration and sustaining irrecoverable damage would be significantly lowered. Despite their forceful measures, you went along with them and did whatever they asked you to. Why? Xavier frowned. He knew Sarah's personality very well. She was an obstinate individual who would never yield to force. When had she become so obedient as to obey the orders of someone who had kidnapped her? This was completely unlike the Sarah that he knew. They said that... At this point, Sarah's face reddened as she bit her lip. As long as I helped them decipher the seal, they would offer you an opportunity to push for a breakthrough to Ancient Sage. Offer me an opportunity to push for a breakthrough to Ancient Sage? Xavier was taken aback. Oh, that's right. They said that you're the most talented Master Teacher on the Master Teacher continent. The roots of both the 100 Schools of Philosophers and the Master Teacher Pavilion trace back to Keith Cole, and they're considered close allies. And as long as we were willing to do them this favor, they would reciprocate as well. Sarah replied awkwardly. So you followed their instructions. Hearing those words, Xavier felt both a little angry and touched at the same time. Sighing deeply, he shook his head and said, I appreciate your intentions, but when have I ever succumbed to a challenge before? It might be difficult to achieve a breakthrough to Ancient Sage, but I haven't fallen so far that I need to sacrifice my own students in exchange for an opportunity for a breakthrough. Rest assured, if there's truly such an opportunity in the world, I will be able to obtain it with my own strength. Teacher, I was wrong. Sarah's voice grew a little meek. It's all right. Xavier waved his hand. Considering that you had good intentions, I won't pursue this matter any further. After which, he turned in the direction of the 8 youths and ordered, Stop! The 5 monarchs and his many great sage artifacts swiftly returned to Xavier's side, leaving 8 incapacitated youths lying powerlessly on the ground. The pummeling that they'd been put under had completely ruined their dashing appearances. This is just a small punishment for kidnapping my students. Anyone who dares to touch my students will have to bear the consequences of their actions. Since Sarah hasn't sustained any injuries as a result of your doings, I'll spare your lives. However, I want you to answer my questions first before I set you free. Looking at the 8 youths on the ground coldly, he asked, Firstly, what are the 100 Schools of Philosophers intending to achieve by snooping around and kidnapping my students? Secondly, have the 100 Schools of Philosophers already allied with the otherworldly demonic tribe? Or could it be that you've converted those otherworldly demons into your subordinates? Upon learning that those of the 100 Schools of Philosophers didn't intend to harm Sarah, a thought surfaced in his mind. Could it be possible that the otherworldly demons he'd seen alongside the 100 Schools of Philosophers were actually their subordinates? He, for example, had managed to forge a soulless metal humanoid out of an otherworldly demon ancient sage, and he had Vicious subdued in his Book of Heaven's Path as well. However, that didn't mean that he was working with the otherworldly demonic tribe. The 100 Schools of Philosophers might have something similar to that. We're only obeying the orders from our superiors. We aren't too sure about the specific details of the matter, so pardon us for being unable to answer your questions. One of the youths answered while hissing in pain. You're unable to answer my questions. Xavier gazed down at the youth intently, as if peering right into his mind. Faced with Xavier's eyes, the youth hesitated for a moment before replying affirmatively, "Correct." "It's fine that you're unwilling to speak. I'll find out soon enough." "No, scram." Xavier turned around and flung his sleeves coldly. He was indebted to Keith Cole, and Ancient Sage Kieran and Ancient Sage Merrill had indirectly helped him as well. Since these youths were their descendants, it did not seem like they had forsaken mankind to ally themselves with the otherworldly demons, so there was no need for him to claim their lives. "We aren't leaving," one of the youths protested resolutely. "Throw them out," Xavier commanded imposingly. The 5 monarchs and the many great sage artifacts charged forward once more, and it did not take long for the 8 youths to be thrown right out of the Hall of Great Accomplishment. Without Sarah's unique constitution escorting them in, they wouldn't be able to enter the subordinate hall again. After dealing with the youths from the 100 schools of philosophers, Xavier finally turned his gaze back to the canvas of 4 seasons. The snow in the painting had mostly melted, and the seal had assumed another form. It was completely different from the seal that Sarah had spent so much effort deciphering earlier. "Teacher, the seal's changed. The seal-releasing techniques that I've learned won't work on it anymore," Sarah said anxiously with a pale face. She tried channeling her cold energy toward the seal, but she realized that she could no longer control it. The attribute of the seal placed on the painting had already changed accordingly to match the season of the painting. "Don't worry, I have my own ways." Xavier chuckled softly as he flicked his finger. The icy crystal he had obtained earlier materialized before him, and he lightly pushed it forward. The icy crystal immediately surged toward the seal, and as soon as it came into contact with the seal, it began to revolve on the spot. It swiftly formed a vortex that devoured the seal on the painting in the blink of an eye. Seeing that the icy crystal was indeed effective against the seal, just as little amulet had said, Xavier heaved a sigh of relief. He quickly beckoned the Sword Saint over. "Let's head in to take a look." Following which, he took the lead and stepped into the unsealed painting. The others also quickly followed suit without any hesitation. Silence returned to the majestic hall. Those who had reached the pinnacle of painting were capable of constructing worlds that anyone could enter and live in. More frighteningly, the world that they created could be so lifelike that one wouldn't even realize that one was in a painting. It was said that tens of thousands of years ago, the Painter Guild had been blessed with a painter of unparalleled talent. He had created his masterpiece, consisting of a massive world and a ravishing beauty when he was in his prime. Obsessed with his work, he had spent much time in his masterpiece along with the ravishing beauty, and, as time passed, he had even fallen in love with her. One day, he entered the painting and never left it again. As a painting created by Keith Cole himself, the Canvas of 4 Seasons was far above the tier of any 9-star painter, be it in terms of conceptualization or grasp of space-time. The painting was almost no different from a massive folded space where the end was nowhere in sight. There's spiritual energy within this painting, and it's extremely concentrated at that. Standing on top of a boulder, Xavier took a deep breath, and he couldn't help but be astounded by the capabilities of Keith Cole. There was no doubt that this painting had surpassed the level of 9-star painters, achieving the realm of unadorned reality. Everything within the painting felt perfectly natural, such that it was impossible to discern any difference between it and the world outside. With an attack of the Dragonbone Divine Spear, Xavier was still able to open dimensional rifts within the painting and traverse through it. More astoundingly, the dimensional rifts would slowly repair themselves as well. Had he not known that it was a painting, he never would have been able to imagine that it was a simulation of reality. Xavier swiftly found a clearing before calling the shocked Sword Saint over. "Give it a try and see if you're able to achieve a breakthrough to Ancient Sage here." As his cultivation was only at the Aureate Body Realm consummation, he was unable to sense the quality that was required for one to achieve a breakthrough to Ancient Sage. However, his parents were already at Sempiternal Realm Consummation, and they were just a step away from reaching that legendary level. Knowing there was bound to be a reason behind their son's words, the duo swiftly sat down and began cultivating quietly. As they began cultivating, the spiritual energy in the area swiftly converged on them and surged into their bodies. Slowly, their auras grew stronger and stronger. Sometime later, the two of them halted their cultivation and stood up.
We are able to feel the bottleneck in our cultivation, and it feels like we'll be able to overcome the bottleneck with sufficient time. At this rate, it might really be possible for us to achieve a breakthrough to Ancient Sage,
St. Lana said. Hearing those words, Xavier's eyes lit up. It was only a deduction from him and Little Amulet that one would be able to achieve a breakthrough to Ancient Sage in the Canvas of Four Seasons. However, if that was truly the case, the value of this painting was truly phenomenal.
Well, since that's the case, why don't the two of you try to push for a breakthrough right now?
Xavier suggested with a smile. Considering how he had kicked out the offspring of the 100 Schools of Philosophers, it was likely that the ancient sage who had stopped him from entering the Pavilion of Frozen Winter earlier would be enraged. If his parents could achieve a breakthrough to Ancient Sage right now, they would at least be less defenseless against other Ancient Sages.
Right now?
Hearing those words, the Sword Saint exchanged glances before shaking their heads bitterly. You're thinking too lightly of Ancient Sages. Well, it's true that a fragmented piece of the ancient world is sealed here, and the quality of the air in here allows one to take the final step forward and achieve a breakthrough to Ancient Sage. However, the Sword said, it still will take a lot of time and effort in order to do so. It's not something that can be achieved in the spur of the moment.
Even among Keith Cole's 3,000 students, only 72 of them successfully reached Ancient Sage. This is not an undertaking that anyone can succeed in. It's true that the aura lingering in this painting is crucial to achieving a breakthrough to Ancient Sage, but if one's accumulation is insufficient, the presence of the quality in the air won't make any difference.
Xavier was startled for a moment before nodding. You're right. His parents were right. Reaching Ancient Sage was a major breakthrough, and it was highly demanding on one's comprehension of the world. If one couldn't even meet the prerequisites for a breakthrough, it was impossible to succeed, even if one was in a suitable environment. Even in the ancient era, not every cultivator was able to become an Ancient Sage. Those who were able to reach that realm were all top-notch geniuses. What exactly is the quality in the air that allows one to achieve a breakthrough to Ancient Sage? Xavier asked.
I can't point out exactly what it is either, but I do know that people named it the Eon of Ancient Sages. Well, as long as one's accumulation reaches a certain level, one will be able to tap into the Eon of Ancient Sages to rise to greater heights, the Sword explained.
The Eon of Ancient Sages? Xavier nodded contemplatively. Does this thing exist naturally in our environment, or is it something that can be depleted?
There aren't any records as to where the Eon of Ancient Sages comes from and why it exists in our world, so I have no way of answering your question for sure, the Sword explained slowly. However, based on my deduction, it's likely to be a depletable resource, just like rare ore. Once we run out of it, it's nearly impossible to bring it back. Back when people realized that it was no longer possible to achieve a breakthrough to Ancient Sage, a huge panic broke out amid the upper echelons of the Master Teacher continent. There were many remarkable talents who'd already accumulated enough to push for a breakthrough, but for some reason they just weren't able to take the final step forward. It was also around that period of time that they discovered the existence of the Eon of Ancient Sages. As the ex-head of the Matthews clan, he had heard of this story from his predecessor. The realization that no one was able to achieve a breakthrough to Ancient Sage anymore had cast a cloak of despair over the Master Teacher continent. Those who had cultivated all their life and reached Sempiternal Realm Consummation with much difficulty suddenly found their cultivation limited. No matter how hard they pushed themselves, they simply were unable to advance any further. It was inevitable that they would be terrified.
Furthermore, the otherworldly demons had also made use of this opportunity to launch attacks on the Master Teacher continent. It truly had been a period of nightmares for mankind. It was fortunate that the ancient sages had then decided to devote their lives to protecting mankind by going into hibernation. Realizing that they were still able to fend against the otherworldly demons for the time being, the panic had gradually calmed down. Were it not for the sacrifices made by the ancient sages, mankind would have already ceased to exist. I understand that the Eon of Ancient Sages is a crucial quality to making a breakthrough to Ancient Sage, but what exactly is required other than that? Xavier asked. His parents had said that they were unable to achieve a breakthrough due to their accumulation being insufficient, but what exactly did that mean? What did they have to accumulate that was insufficient? Or in other words, what requirements did one have to meet in order to push for a breakthrough to the highest realm? And ever since the ancient era, ancient sages have been the symbol of the highest fighting prowess in the world. There's been a lot of research done into studying the requirements in order to achieve a breakthrough to that pinnacle realm. Firstly, the presence of the Eon of Ancient Sages is necessary. Secondly, one's soul depth must reach 30. Thirdly, one must achieve a soul span of 1,000,000 miles, the sword explained. Soul span of 1,000,000 miles? Xavier frowned. What does that mean? He could understand the first two requirements that the sword had mentioned, but what did the third one mean? Oh, it's really simple. When you refine your soul energy into a soul thread and extend it outward, the longest distance that your soul thread's able to reach is your soul span. Xavier fell into deep thought. His soul had been tempered by lightning and heavenly flames, making it extraordinarily powerful. He had also used his soul energy to perceive his surroundings before. However, he had never tried threading his soul energy and extending it as far as possible. Seeing the expression on Xavier's face, the sword could tell that his son had never tried testing his soul span before, so he asked with a chuckle, "Do you want to give it a try? See what your soul span is?" Those who were unaware of the conditions required to achieve a breakthrough to Ancient Sage would not bother testing their souls in such a manner. It was dangerous to spread one's soul too far outward. If the soul thread snapped, one could potentially incur severe damage. All right, I'll give it a try. Xavier nodded in agreement. He was also curious to see how far he could go. Taking a deep breath, Xavier began refining his soul energy into a soul thread before pushing it outward. 100,000 miles, 200,000 miles, 300,000 miles. In the blink of an eye, he had already passed the 500,000-mile mark, but his soul thread showed no signs of slowing down. In fact, he realized that he hadn't even used a tenth of his soul energy yet. Xavier finally came to a halt. "How is it?" the Sword Saint asked curiously. They knew that their son was the head of the Adonis clan and had a Soul Oracle student. Without a doubt, he was likely to be highly proficient in the field of soul arts. However, they weren't too sure what realm he had reached, so it was inevitable for them to be interested in his results. Xavier scratched his head awkwardly. "The world in here is simply too small. My soul thread's already reached the end of it." While this was a world that Keith Cole had created through extraordinary means, it was ultimately still a folded space. There was no way that it could be boundless like the Master Teacher continent. All in all, the world here was less than 1,000,000 miles wide in diameter. It wasn't large enough for him to push himself to his limits. However, if one thing was for sure, when it came to souls, he was already comparable to ancient sages. Of course, he would only be comparable to them in terms of quantity. When it came to quality, he was still severely lacking. At the very most, he would only be able to protect himself from the soul offense of an ancient sage. He was still lacking sufficient power to quell experts of that level. Even though the world in this painting is small, the fact that you were able to reach the end of the world shows that you possess extraordinary soul span. As long as you raise your soul depth and cultivation up to the mark, you should be able to reach Ancient Sage, the sword remarked in astonishment. His son's talent was truly overpowered. While other cultivators struggled to keep up with their soul span even after their cultivation had reached Sempiternal Realm consummation, he had already met the requirement despite only being at Aureate Body Realm consummation. Perhaps the bottleneck that had made Ancient Sage unreachable to most cultivators might be a mere mini hurdle for him, just like any other cultivation realm. Actually, it's not too difficult to increase your soul span. Well, I have a soul cultivation technique manual here that the two of you can cultivate. Xavier flicked his wrist and took out a book. As one who had comprehended the soul quintessence and inherited the heritage of the soul oracles, he had long formed his own school of study regarding souls. The soul cultivation technique manual he was offering to the Sword Saint was tailored to the constitution of those in the Matthews clan. As it was completely unrelated to the heritage of the Adonis clan, it couldn't be considered betraying the Adonis clan's secrets. This cultivation technique is indeed highly effective at increasing one's soul span. As long as we cultivate it diligently, we should be able to reach a soul span of 1,000,000 miles within a month, the Sword remarked after swiftly browsing through the manual. I'm looking forward to the day that you two become ancient sages, Xavier said with a chuckle. I'm glad that you think so highly of the two of us, but it really isn't as easy as that. The Sword shook his head. Other than the 3 core requirements, there are many other factors that can affect the possibility of one's breakthrough to Ancient Sage, such as one's understanding of cultivation, one's ability to harmonize with the world, and one's state of mind. In any case, a breakthrough to Ancient Sage is truly no easy feat. As powerful as your soul cultivation technique is, it'll only increase our chances of success by 10%. Only 10%? Xavier was taken aback. Well, indeed, stepping into the Ancient Sage realm symbolizes overcoming one's fundamental limits to reach a higher level of existence. To make an analogy, it's no different from a carp leaping over the Dragon's Gate. One's constitution changes completely, including one's life energy powers. There's no way to make that leap that easily, the Sword explained. However, before he could finish his piece, he suddenly felt the world around him quaking intensely, and surges of spiritual energy were swiftly gathering in a certain direction, following which an overwhelming burst of energy gushed into the heavens, splitting the world in half. Someone's achieving a breakthrough, Ancient Sage! The Sword widened his eyes in disbelief. He felt as if his head was going to explode. Not a moment earlier he said that it would be incredibly difficult to achieve a breakthrough to Ancient Sage. Who in the world was it? The Sword quickly turned his sight to the center of the vortex, and he saw an eerie-looking saber floating quietly in the air, greedily devouring the spiritual energy and eon of ancient sages in the air. Its strength swiftly grew greater and greater. It was as if rivers of spiritual energy were filling up an ocean. The flow of energy was so quick that it caused the saber to shake non-stop. This is your weapon? The Sword gulped. The dazed Xavier nodded in response. He was taken aback by the situation as well. The one that was achieving a breakthrough at the moment was the infernal black saber. He didn't place it back into his storage ring after chasing the 8 youths from the 100 schools of philosophers away, so it had ended up following him into the canvas of 4 seasons. In the first place, the infernal black saber was a half-ancient sage artifact, and it had devoured the fresh blood and souls of 110,000 otherworldly demon soldiers. It had already accumulated enough for a breakthrough, but it had just been lacking the final catalyst to do so. The eon of ancient sages in the painting just so happened to be what it lacked, thus allowing it to successfully advance to Ancient Sage. A tremendous amount of spiritual energy swept across the area like a hurricane, causing the ground to tremor intensely. As the infernal black saber continued to absorb spiritual energy furiously from the painting, the surrounding space began to dissipate. The spiritual energy in here isn't sufficient for it to make a breakthrough. If this continues, I fear that the world in the painting will be completely destroyed. The Sword narrowed his eyes in horror. Usually, when a cultivator pushed for a breakthrough to Ancient Sage, they would prepare ample cultivation resources so they wouldn't abruptly run out of energy in the midst of their breakthrough. However, the infernal black saber was just a weapon, so it was inevitable that it would neglect something like that. Xavier hadn't expected it to achieve a breakthrough at that moment, so he hadn't made preparations in advance. If they were on the Master-Teacher continent, there might still have been ample spiritual energy in the air to sustain its breakthrough. However, they were in a painting. Considering how its foundations weren't too stable in the first place, the surrounding space was already starting to collapse due to the strain that it was under. At this rate, the entire painting might just be utterly destroyed. It had not been easy for him to find the Eon of Ancient Sages required for one to make a breakthrough to Ancient Sage. It would be a huge waste if the painting was destroyed just like that. "Infernal Black Saber, absorb this!" Knowing that there was no time to lose, Xavier flicked his finger. A droplet of blood, harnessing a concentrated reservoir of energy, surged toward the Infernal Black Saber. It was the blood that old geezer Troy had shed after he was injured. The old ancestor of the Matthews clan had collected the blood and given it to him. If there was anything that he had that could provide sufficient energy for the Infernal Black Saber to achieve a breakthrough, it was that. As soon as the Infernal Black Saber came into contact with the blood, it swiftly absorbed it. However, it seemed like the spiritual energy harnessed within a single droplet was not enough for its breakthrough. Thus, Xavier flicked the other droplets over one after another. Soon, he had depleted all 5 droplets of old geezer Troy's blood. It was only after absorbing the 5th droplet of blood that the Infernal Black Saber finally calmed down. An aura of invincibility drifted from its body, and it felt as if it could split the painting in two and escape with just a single slash. A dimensional rift appeared in the sky of the painting, and ominous clouds swiftly gushed in. It was a cultivation ordeal, the Ancient Sage ordeal. Under normal circumstances, it would have been impossible to summon a cultivation ordeal within a folded space. However, the Ancient Sage ordeal was simply so powerful that the world within the painting wasn't able to stop it. Lightning and heavenly flames descended from the sky and shrouded the Infernal Black Saber. The Infernal Black Saber swiftly channeled the remaining energy from old geezer Troy's blood to alleviate the destructive might from the cultivation ordeal, allowing it to absorb the energy safely. Slowly, crimson marks surfaced on its blade. Under the tempering of the lightning and heavenly flames, the Infernal Black Saber became more and more sinister. Just a glance at it was more than enough to unnerve one's will. Some time later, the ominous clouds finally began to dissipate, leaving the Infernal Black Saber floating quietly in the air. With a light slash, the space in the painting was sliced apart as easily as a block of cheese.
Oh, I have finally reached Ancient Sage.
The Infernal Black Saber burst into laughter, following which it turned to Xavier and laid on the ground.
"Thank you, Master."
Rise! With a wave of his hand, the Infernal Black Saber fell into Xavier's hand. He immediately felt the destructive energy harnessed within it. Before, he would need to resort to all kinds of means in order to defeat a Sempiternal Realm consummation expert. However, with the Infernal Black Saber in his grasp, he would be able to easily slay dozens of Sempiternal Realm consummation experts with just a simple slash. Even though there was only a realm of difference between Ancient Sage and Sempiternal Realm consummation, the gap between the two realms was as great as the distance between the heavens and the earth. This difference was not something that could be breached with just quantity. "I'll finally be able to protect myself from Ancient Sages now." Xavier's eyes lit up. Even though the Golden Page did grant him the ability to kill Ancient Sages, it had its limitations too. For example, if old geezer Troy had continued hiding quietly, he would have been unable to do anything about the other party, even if he had the Golden Page in mind. However, the situation was completely different now that the Infernal Black Saber had reached Ancient Sage. If old geezer Troy made a move on him again, the Infernal Black Saber would surely be able to trace the origin of his aura and injure him. That was also how the old ancestor of the Matthews clan managed to drive old geezer Troy away. This was another invaluable trump card in his possession. If he used it together with the otherworldly demon Ancient Sage corpse, he would be able to kill Ancient Sages in a surprise assault. He was no longer as reliant on the Golden Page as he was before. "All right, you should reinforce your cultivation," Xavier instructed. The Infernal Black Saber nodded, and it began flitting into the distance to find a quiet spot to cultivate. However, before it could get far, it ran into the Dragonbone Divine Spear, which was making its way over. It hurriedly bowed respectfully to the latter before going on its way. It was only after reaching Ancient Sage that the infernal black saber realized just how powerful the seal placed on the Dragonbone Divine Spear was. Once its seal was released, there was no doubt that it wouldn't stand a chance at all against the Dragonbone Divine Spear.
Xav, your spear!
Upon seeing that sight, the sword widened his eyes in astonishment. The hierarchy among artifacts was extremely straightforward. They would only bow to artifacts stronger than them. If the infernal black saber had paid its respects to the Dragonbone Divine Spear, did it not mean that the latter was even stronger than an ancient sage artifact? He knew that the Dragonbone Divine Spear was no ordinary power, but he wasn't too sure just how powerful it was. It's nothing much. It's just another minor fortuitous encounter, Xavier explained with a smile.
It's just another minor fortuitous encounter.
The sword staggered on the spot and nearly broke down.
Do you have some kind of misunderstanding as to what minor fortuitous encounter means? If your Dragonbone Divine Spear, Infernal Black Saber, and all those great sage artifacts you have here are only minor fortuitous encounters, what in the world could be called a major fortuitous encounter?
Wait here for a moment. I'll go tame this painting. Without explaining himself, Xavier quickly made his way toward a certain direction. Not too long later, he arrived before a cave. With a simple grasp, a scroll appeared in his hand. It was the original painting of the Canvas of Four Seasons. He had found the painting while threading his soul energy together to extend it as far as he could. With a few taps, the painting swiftly acknowledged him as its master, and he stowed it into his storage ring. With a jolt, the Sword Saint suddenly found themselves returning to the hall. They instinctively turned their sights toward where the painting had previously been placed, only to find that it had completely disappeared from sight. A short moment later, Xavier also left the painting and materialized on the spot. Do you want to cultivate here, or follow me? The greatest treasure in the Hall of Great Accomplishment was the Canvas of Four Seasons. However, the sculptures of the 72 sages, the rich spiritual energy, and the inscriptions on the walls were all invaluable resources for cultivation as well. They would be able to advance their cultivation tenfold faster in this hall than anywhere else. The Sword Saint glanced at one another before shaking their heads in unison. We won't be following you anymore. It's peaceful here, and it's a good opportunity for us to cultivate our souls and state of mind, as well as to assimilate the ancient sage blood. We'll try to achieve a breakthrough here. They had realized that they would only be a burden to their son if they followed him with their current strength. Since that was the case, it would be better for them to remain in the Hall of Great Accomplishment and cultivate. If they could achieve a breakthrough to Ancient Sage, they might still be able to continue supporting their son in his endeavors. I'll remain here too, Harper said. At Xavier's behest, she got into the hall along with Xavier's parents. She had only recently achieved a breakthrough to the introspective convalescence realm, and she would be even more of a burden if she insisted on following Xavier around. Sarah stepped forward and said, Teacher, I'll follow you. I know where they took Gia and Alan. Xavier nodded. He pondered for a moment before flicking his finger, sending a droplet of the ancient sage blood toward Sarah. Absorb this droplet of blood first. Many dangers lay ahead of them. Even though every droplet of ancient sage blood was an invaluable treasure, there was nothing more important to him than his student's safety. Yes! Sarah quickly sat down and absorbed the droplet of blood into her body. Power flurried through it, and in less than 10 minutes she stood up once more with brilliant light shining from her eyes. Have you managed to assimilate the ancient sage blood? Xavier asked in astonishment. The reason for him being able to assimilate the blood so swiftly was because the blood from the old ancestor had originated from him. However, why was Sarah able to do it so quickly as well? Oh, yes, teacher. Sarah nodded. Well, after you reconstructed my life energy paths, I realized that I'm able to convert any energy into my gleam swiftly. Even though the droplet of blood harnessed a lot of energy, it still didn't pose too much of a problem for me to assimilate it. Life energy paths? Xavier frowned. He tapped his finger and sent a surge of gleam into Sarah's body to check on her condition. It seemed like after the alteration in Sarah's life energy paths, her ability to assimilate energy into her body had become far stronger than other cultivators. In that respect, even Xavier would pale in comparison to her. Then again, considering how her life energy path network was even more rational than that of an ancient sage, it was no wonder that she'd been able to assimilate ancient sage blood so swiftly. Let's go. The fact that Sarah had assimilated the ancient sage blood meant that she at the very least had a life preservation method if anything bad happened. Bidding farewell to his parents, Xavier began making his way out of the Hall of Great Accomplishment together with Sarah. Looking at the departing duo, a bitter smile crept onto the sword's face as he remarked, "He might be my son, but I have to say that he and his students are really overpowered." Just to assimilate a droplet of ancient sage blood, they had to store it in their aura and absorb it bit by bit over a month or so. On the other hand, those two were actually able to assimilate it into their bodies within moments. This was truly an inconceivable feat. "We need to work much harder as well. Otherwise, if our son and his students surpass us, we won't be able to maintain our dignity as elders before them," St. Lana said. Indeed. The sword nodded. The two of them sat down on the floor and began cultivating.
"Old ancestor, you have to redress our grievances!"
Outside the Hall of Great Accomplishment, the 8 youths who had been driven out were crying with snot and tears dripping down their faces. They had dedicated much time and effort to preparing for the expedition before they were finally able to get into the Hall of Great Accomplishment. They had never expected that they would be viciously pummeled before being thrown out of the subordinate hall before they could acquire anything at all.
"You can only blame yourselves for your lack of strength,"
the hidden ancient sage remarked with a hint of resignation in his tone.
"It's not that we're weak, but that Froze tamed so many beasts and powerful artifacts. If not for those, there's no way that he would have been a match for us."
One of the youths gritted his teeth hatefully. What was great about that fellow? All he had were his tamed beasts and artifacts. Without those, there was no way that he would stand a chance against them.
"That's right. Old ancestor, we beseech you to create a chance for us to have a fair duel with him. If he is able to defeat us without those external aids, we'll willingly admit our defeat then."
The other youths quickly nodded in agreement. The old ancestor was silent for a moment before speaking up once more.
"Brother Lupin, my descendants would like to have a fair duel with your descendant. Will you grant me this favor?"
Feel free to discuss any arrangements with my descendant. Rest assured, as long as you don't resort to anything unprincipled, I don't intend to intervene in his matters," the old ancestor of the Matthews clan said. While Xavier and the others had entered the Hall of Great Accomplishment, he had remained hidden in the vicinity.
"That is a relief,"
the old ancestor of the 100 Schools of Philosophers replied. The seal of the Hall of Great Accomplishment glowed, and Xavier and Sarah flew out.
"Where do you think you're going?"
The 8 youths, with a couple of others from the 100 Schools of Philosophers, swiftly surrounded the two of them as soon as they appeared. "What? Do you still want a pummeling?" Xavier harumphed coldly. He had already spared their lives, but they didn't know gratitude. Did they really think that he was a pushover?
"We want a fair duel with you, one-on-one. You aren't allowed your weapons or tamed beasts."
"Do you dare take up our challenge?" One of the youths spat coldly. "Fair duel? What are the stakes, then?" Xavier shot a nonchalant glance at the youth. Without any stakes, he couldn't be bothered to waste his time fighting a meaningless battle with this crowd. Before the youth could reply, the voice of the ancient sage sounded in the air.
"Earlier, Brother Lupin gave you 5 droplets of ancient sage blood. If you are able to win the duel against them, I will offer you 5 droplets of ancient sage blood as the wager. This is the stake that we are waiting to offer. What do you have to offer us, then?"
"What do I have to offer?" Xavier pondered for a moment before saying, "I can spare their lives." The ancient sage suddenly felt an uncomfortable throbbing in his heart.
"If you lose to us, you have to hand over the canvas of 4 seasons.
Indeed, you have to bring out the canvas of 4 seasons as your wager, the other youths shouted vehemently. However, before they could finish their piece, they found Xavier looking at them with a gaze that seemed as though he was looking at fools. Are you dreaming? Do you think that those few droplets of blood from your old ancestor are worth bringing out the canvas of 4 seasons as a wager? Then your wager won't work either. If you lose the duel, we'll have nothing to gain from the battle. The crowd from the 100 Schools of Philosophers protested furiously. The ancient sage from the 100 Schools of Philosophers felt even more stifled than before. Well, that isn't any of my business, is it? It's not as if I'm really interested in having this duel with you. If you don't want to battle me, we can always call the duel off, Xavier uttered as he stretched his back lazily. He had not intended to duel with those from the 100 Schools of Philosophers in the first place, so it wasn't as if it would hurt him dearly not to have the duel. How about this? We will bet 5 droplets of blood for an opportunity to achieve a breakthrough in your canvas of 4 seasons, the ancient sage from the 100 Schools of Philosophers suggested. That wager sounds fair to me, but I'm only at the Aureate Body Realm Consummation, whereas your descendants are all Sempiternal Realm Consummation cultivators. There are 2 realms of difference between us, so isn't it extremely disadvantageous for me to be unable to use my artifacts and tamed beasts? Xavier said. I'll have them lower their cultivation to your level, the ancient sage from the 100 Schools of Philosophers replied. It was indeed unfair for them to impose so many restrictions on the other party, and yet send cultivators of higher realms against him. That would be great. Let's begin then. Xavier nodded before taking a step forward. With a light chuckle, he remarked, so that we don't waste each other's time, you may come at me together. However, if you come at me all at once, I might not be able to hold myself back. I'll have to ask for your pardon if a couple of you lose your lives in the process. You want to kill us? Try it then, one of the youths sneered coldly. He suppressed his cultivation down to Aureate Body Realm Consummation before charging toward Xavier, making the first move. Using some mysterious secret art, the movement of the youth became extremely swift. In the blink of an eye, the youth had already arrived before Xavier, and his palm was about to strike diagonally down toward Xavier's head. In that instant, the youth thought that he had already gotten Xavier for good. But before his palm could connect, he suddenly felt a sharp sensation in his chest as air rushed out of his lungs. Turning his eyes downward, he found that the other party's palm had already sunk right into his chest. The youth flew into the distance before crashing wretchedly on the floor, coughing up huge mouthfuls of blood. To his astonishment, he couldn't even discern how Xavier had made a move on him at all. It was as if the other party's palm had simply teleported right in front of him. Come at me together. There's no way any of you stand a chance against me one-on-one. Xavier shot a glance at the remaining youths. Let's get them together. The crowd had seen the earlier exchange, and they realized that the other party's fighting prowess was far greater than theirs in the same cultivation realm. There was no way they could possibly hope to defeat him alone. Without hesitating, they nodded at one another before charging at the other party simultaneously. Before the crowd could even reach Xavier, the person in question had already charged right into them. Like a tiger around a herd of lambs, there was not a single person who was able to withstand a blow from him. They were the top geniuses from the 100 Schools of Philosophers, and they had prided themselves on their superior fighting prowess against their peers. Yet before the young man, the strength that they were so confident in was so laughably pathetic that it seemed as if they were little kids parading before an adult. How can he be so powerful? Witnessing this scene, the ancient sage of the 100 Schools of Philosophers could swiftly tell that his descendants had lost the battle. Even though the other party was only at Aureate Body Realm Consummation, his true fighting prowess was already on par with Sempiternal Realm cultivators. Of the entire 100 Schools of Philosophers, the only one known to possess such superior capability was Keith Cole. Watching the battle a little longer, it was painfully apparent that even in a group battle, they were not close to being a match for Xavier. As much as he didn't want to admit it, the ancient sage of the 100 Schools of Philosophers still sighed deeply and advised, You aren't a match for him. Admit defeat. However, barely after he spoke those words, an unexpected situation occurred. Under the relentless assault from the group from the 100 Schools of Philosophers, Xavier accidentally made a fatal mistake, leaving him open for a brief moment. One of the youths keenly noticed this opportunity and pierced his finger toward Xavier's blind spot. In the face of this unexpected crisis, perhaps it was because Xavier thought it was too late for him to avoid the attack, that he lifted his palm to strike the youth's head instead. This was a move of mutually assured destruction. The youth might be able to pierce his finger through Xavier's heart, but he would also have his head smashed to bits by the latter. More importantly, judging from the frightening momentum of the duo's movements, it was already too late for them to retract their attacks. "Halt!" the ancient sage of the 100 Schools of Philosophers roared anxiously. A powerful surge of energy swiftly shrouded the entire area, sealing the surroundings. It seemed like the ancient sage of the 100 Schools of Philosophers had decided to make a move in order to prevent a tragedy from happening. However, a moment after he released his energy, the young man below, who was moments away from having his heart pierced, suddenly moved in an awkward trajectory and mysteriously avoided the deadly attack, following which a saber materialized in his palm. To the astonishment of the ancient sage of the 100 Schools of Philosophers, the target of the saber was not his descendants, but him. "That is an ancient sage weapon!" The ancient sage of the 100 Schools of Philosophers narrowed his eyes in shock. He didn't think that the young man would intentionally reveal a flaw just to lure him into making a move and confirm his location. He immediately attempted to flee, but it was already too late. The saber had wrapped its aura around him, keeping him firmly in place. A sharp glint flashed across the air, and fresh blood spurted into it. "You have my deepest gratitude for your generosity," Xavier chuckled softly as he swiftly caught all of the blood with a gourd that he had prepared. All in all, there were over 20 droplets of blood. Those 5 droplets of ancient sage blood were no longer enough for him to make a move. From the very start, this was what he was aiming for. The ancient sage of the 100 Schools of Philosophers had been polite to him on the surface, but he had overlooked the despicable actions committed by his descendants, turning a blind eye as they kidnapped his students and made use of them for their own gains. Not only that, but he had even used his powers to stop him from getting to Sarah. There was no way that he would miss an opportunity to get even with the other party. "Phew!" Having lost too much blood, the face of the ancient sage of the 100 Schools of Philosophers paled from frailty. Infuriated by the sudden assault, he was just about to make a move when he suddenly felt an imposing aura raging by the side. It was the old ancestor of the Matthews clan, Lupin, warning him against making a move on his descendant. Knowing that he could not afford to fight with Lupin at the moment, he suppressed his raging fury and held himself back. To think that an ancient sage like him had actually been fooled by an Oriate body realm brat, even suffering injuries in the process. Such a thing was completely unthinkable. "The young head of the Matthews clan sure is a remarkable figure. I am impressed. Our 100 Schools of Philosophers admit our loss. Farewell." With a powerful gale, the ancient sage of the 100 Schools of Philosophers swiftly pulled his descendants back to his side before turning around, preparing to leave the area. "Wait a moment. Where are the 5 droplets of ancient sage blood that you promised me for losing the challenge? Are you intending to renege on your promise?" Xavier shouted after the ancient sage. The ancient sage of the 100 Schools of Philosophers staggered upon hearing those words. Suppressing the stifling feeling in his chest, he flicked a jade bottle over before leaving decisively. He was afraid that he would be choked to death if he continued conversing with the young man. That's more like it. Catching the jade bottle, Xavier nodded in satisfaction. Those who wanted to force him into a duel had to pay a corresponding price for their actions. Not even ancient sages would be an exception to that. "Your same has made a breakthrough ancient sage, has it?" The old ancestor of the Matthews clan asked in shock. He could hardly believe what he had just seen. Xavier nodded affirmatively. "Great! Well, that's great!" There was a brief moment of silence before the old ancestor of the Matthews clan burst into hearty laughter. Over the years, he had been single-handedly propping the Matthews clan up, and it was extremely tiring for him. He knew that if he passed away, the Matthews clan would swiftly fall into decline, and that was not something he was willing to see. However, the breakthrough of that saber meant that the Matthews clan had another ancient sage to rely on. Furthermore, the lifespan of an artifact was far longer than a human's. There was no doubt that its existence would ensure the safety of the Matthews clan for a very long time. I still have some students who are in the hands of the 100 Schools of Philosophers, so I'll be taking my leave. Xavier clasped his fist. With the departure of the ancient sages of the 100 Schools of Philosophers and the otherworldly demonic tribe, there was nothing else that could pose a threat to them there. Go on! The old ancestor of the Matthews clan waved his hand. If not for the interference of the old ancestor from the Matthews clan, his earlier assault wouldn't have succeeded. In the worst-case scenario, he might have even died to the otherworldly demon ancient sage earlier. Thus he bowed deeply to the old ancestor of the Matthews clan before prompting Sarah to lead the way ahead. The two of them ran an extremely long distance, and it wasn't until the Hall of Great Accomplishment was nothing but a blur in the scenery that Sarah finally came to a halt. I entered this space with the 100 Schools of Philosophers from here, Sarah said. Taking a look, Xavier realized that this was the place where he and Harper had entered. It seemed like it was the same for the others as well. Break! Xavier had only managed to arrive in the exteriors of the Hall of Great Accomplishment through the offerings of the otherworldly demonic tribe, which had opened a spatial passageway there. However, with the infernal black saber upgraded to ancient sage tier, he didn't have to depend on such elaborate techniques anymore. With a slash of the infernal black saber, a black rift appeared in midair. Xavier pulled Sarah and leaped right into the black rift. The next moment, the two of them returned to the dimension of 4 seasons. However, what stood before him was no longer a field of snow. Flowers had bloomed amid verdant greenery, replacing the monotonous whiteness from before. It would seem that even without the icy crystal, the seasons still flowed here. If not for the fact that the introspective Convalescence Realm Elder was still in the area, he would have wondered if he had entered another world. Having been in this dimension before, it did not take him too long to find the exit to the world. The duo swiftly dove through the spatial seal to enter the next dimension. Before they knew it, they found themselves standing in the midst of a mountain forest filled with miasma. Sarah took a look at the surrounding environment.
Gia is likely to be in a subordinate hole corresponding to this dimension.
Xavier nodded in agreement. He flicked his wrist and a pill appeared in his palm. Swallow this.
All right.
Sarah popped the pill into her mouth before asking doubtfully,
Peter, this an antidote?
The air and water here are poisonous. Monitor your condition and be careful, Xavier explained. Due to his innate fetal poison, he had devoted a fair portion of his time to studying poison. With a glance he could tell that the mountain forest wasn't as simple as it seemed. Despite the silence drifting in the area, there were no formidable beasts that posed a threat. The truth was that the entire area was suffused with lethal poison that would callously suffocate the unwary. Following closely behind her teacher, Sarah asked,
Peter, what do we do now?
Let's find the exit of this dimension for the time being. My guess is correct. The location of the subordinate hall should be directly above the exit, Xavier said. Having gone through a couple of dimensions, he was already fairly well versed in the rules. He randomly picked a direction with his Dragonbone Divine Spear, confounding Sarah in the process, before trudging off in the chosen direction. There were venomous scorpions and snakes all over the jungle, but as one who possessed the Heaven's Path Gleam, Xavier didn't fear them. They carried on ahead without facing much danger. After traveling for roughly an hour, they encountered a group of master teachers whose faces had turned frighteningly pale. It was apparent that they had been poisoned. Xavier gave them a couple of pills infused with Heaven's Path Gleam to cure them of the poison, following which he asked them a few questions to determine the approximate location of the exit before rushing over. This should be it. Roughly 2 hours later, the duo finally halted right before a medium-sized pond.
This seems to be nothing more than an ordinary pond. Teacher, why do you think that this is the exit?
Sarah asked doubtfully. She had also heard the answers provided by the group of master teachers, but even they had been oblivious to the true location of the exit. How could her teacher be so certain about the matter? Well, that's simple. Without bothering to explain himself, Xavier swiped his hand through the air and grabbed an ant in between his fingertips. This ant was crimson in color, and it was roughly the size of a bean. With just a glance, it was clear that it was an extremely venomous creature. With a light chuckle, Xavier placed the ant on the back of his hand. Without any hesitation, the ant bit through Xavier's skin, injecting venom right into his bloodstream. At the same time, Xavier did not use his Heaven's Path Gleam to neutralize the poison, allowing it to spread freely through his body instead. In the blink of an eye, the back of his hand had already started turning black, and blisters were starting to form. Teacher! Not understanding the intentions behind her teacher's actions, Sarah panicked. She could tell that the venom that had just been injected into her teacher's body was deadly. If it made its way toward her teacher's heart through the bloodstream, that could result in instantaneous death. Calm down. There's no need to worry, Xavier said calmly. With a casual wave of his hand, the water in the pond splashed into the air and scattered over his wound. It was as if the lethal poison on the back of his hand had encountered its nemesis. White smoke rose into the air, and the blackness and blisters from before swiftly retreated. Before long, his hand had reverted to its original state, as if it had never been poisoned before. Sarah was taken aback. Is the water in this pond actually an antidote? That's right, Xavier nodded. Well, as treacherous as these dimensions seem, Keith Cole left them behind in order to test the future generations to see if they're qualified to inherit his treasures. Well, his aim was never to cause meaningless deaths. As such, there was bound to be an antidote of some kind near the exit. Otherwise, it would be meaningless for him to leave his heritage behind, only to have no one alive to inherit it. Sarah nodded in realization. I asked the group of master teachers that we encountered earlier where the most dangerous location, the place that has the greatest number of venomous creatures, is in this dimension, and they pointed me toward here. The cultivation technique that Keith Cole practices emphasizes the harmony of nature. Where there's yin, yang is bound to exist as well. Wherever the density of venomous creatures is the greatest, it's likely to be where the antidote lies. That's why I was so certain that this is where the exit lies, Xavier said confidently. He knew that it was impossible for the group of master teachers that he'd encountered previously to know where the exit was. If they knew, they would have escaped from the poison dimension instead of wandering helplessly around the area. While they didn't know where the exit was, in the long period of time that they'd spent there, they should have gotten a rough idea of where the more treacherous terrain was. After they made their way there, the first thing that Xavier realized was that there were no venomous creatures around the perimeter of the pond. That was more than enough to back up his deduction. Realizing that they were right before the exit, Sarah asked, Teacher, should we tear open a dimensional rift right now to save Gia? Based on what her teacher had said, the subordinate hall where Gia had likely been taken was right above the pond. We are going to save her, but before that there's one more thing that we have to do. Wait here for me while I go into the pond to take a look. The fact that the antidote that neutralizes the poison from the venomous creatures in this dimension can be found within this pond means that the crux to the dimension is likely to be in here as well. We'll have to grab that first, Xavier said. The crux of the forest dimension were the 5 monarchs. In the desert dimension, it was the berserk yellow sand wood. In the dimension of 4 seasons, it was the crystal. There was little doubt that something similar could be found in the poison dimension as well. Like the crystal, it was likely to be an artifact that would play a crucial role in whatever they encountered within the subordinate hall. In any case, it was always better to be prepared. After saying those words, Xavier leaped right into the clear pond without any hesitation. With a depth of around 30 feet, the pond wasn't too deep. Beyond that was where the spatial seal that led to the next dimension lay. Instead of entering the spatial seal, Xavier chose to swim around its vicinity to take a closer look. But even after swimming all the way around once, he was unable to find anything at all. Putting aside any life forms, he couldn't even find any rocks, ores, or anything that could remotely resemble an artifact. It was all clear water. Did I guess incorrectly? Wait, does the crux of the dimension not lie here? Or could it be that someone's beaten me to it? Xavier frowned. No, that's not right. If someone's claimed the crux of the dimension, the poison lingering in the air would have receded by now. In the desert dimension, the desert had vanished after he took the Berserk Yellow Sand Wood. In the forest dimension, as he left together with the 5 monarchs, it wasn't clear what had happened after they departed. Nevertheless, no longer restricted by the authority of the 5 monarchs, it was unlikely for the beasts in the dimension to remain so orderly. The same applied to the poison dimension as well. Considering how poison was still lingering in the air, and the pond still possessed the properties of an antidote, it was likely that the crux of the dimension hadn't been found yet. Eye of insight. Xavier scrutinized every nook and cranny within the pond, and soon he noticed something that was amiss. The substance that would neutralize the surrounding poison seemed to be growing scarcer and scarcer. Xavier pondered for a moment before flying out of the pond. He waited for a few seconds before checking on the pond once more, only to find that the substance had fully regenerated within.
Teacher, have you found it yet?
Sarah asked. Not yet. However, I have a good guess as to what the crux of the formation is. Bring me a bamboo pole, Xavier instructed with a smile. Sarah left the area. Shortly after, she returned with a bamboo pole in her hand. Taking the bamboo pole, Xavier shook it lightly, jolting the leaves off. Driving his gleam through the bamboo pole, he manifested his gleam as a thin thread at the other end of it, before concentrating his gleam at the very tip of the thread, as if preparing delicious bait for the prey to be reeled in.
This is a fishing rod! But teacher, are you intending to fish at this pond?
Sarah was taken aback. Fish with a rod and not with a net. Hunt not those back in their nests. If I'm not mistaken, the crux of this dimension can only be fished out. Other methods will only drive it further away, Xavier explained with a smile. In the past he had read a book about Keith Cole, and it depicted a saying of his. Fish with a rod, and not with a net. Hunt not those back in their nests. What it meant was that Keith Cole fished with a fishing rod and not through fishing nets, and even though he did use the bow and arrow to hunt animals, he would never attempt to shoot down those that were resting. This was an analogy to display Keith Cole's benevolence, but it seemed like it had a deeper meaning. Using forceful means would not get him what he wanted within the pond. The only way was to literally fish. Xavier placed a venomous worm and his fishing pole inside the pond before sitting quietly by the side. Fishing could temper one's state of mind and rid one of restlessness and anxiety, allowing one to be more aligned with nature. Even ordinary mortals could fuse into their surroundings while fishing, creating a scene as still as a painting, let alone cultivators at his level of cultivation. As the fishing line he had made out of gleam swayed along with the ripples in the pond, Xavier suddenly felt that the poison dimension wasn't as frightening as it seemed. It was another creation of nature, and it was both real and authentic. In ancient times, when the world was rich with spiritual energy, no humans would dare to step into the primordial forests. Miasma lingered in those places, and venomous creatures prowled the area, ready to sink their toxins into any unwary souls. It was rather similar to the poison dimension that he was currently in. This dimension was not an artificial creation. It was one of the primordial forests that had withstood the test of time. In here, one could experience the true nature of nature. Driving the cultivation technique that he had practiced while achieving a breakthrough to Great Sage, Xavier seemed to have become a part of the natural world as well, fusing in with the boulders, trees, and dirt. Under the extreme calmness, his soul depth began to rise. 29.91, 29.92. While Xavier was in a trance, the water before him suddenly rippled, following which an anxious voice filled the air.
Teacher, a fish has taken the bait!
Lowering his head, Xavier saw a bright red koi fish hanging on his gleam thread, struggling desperately. Water splashed all around the area.
Ah, what a pity.
It was great that he had caught the fish, but it had also jolted him out of his trance. Had it not, his soul depth might have reached 30, thus hitting the prerequisite for him to become an ancient sage. Xavier lowered his wrist lightly before swinging it backward powerfully. The bright red koi fish was flung right out of the pond. Thrown out of the water, the koi fish struggled on the ground as its mouth opened and closed desperately as if it couldn't catch its breath. A moment later, it flipped over with its eyes bulging from their sockets, seemingly having breathed its last breath.
Teacher, is the fish dead?
Sarah asked in uncertainty. Wasn't this the crux of the dimension? Why did it die as soon as it was fished up? Was it not meant to be fished up? All right, that's enough. Xavier kicked the body of the koi fish lightly, and it bounced up a few times in response to the stimulus before falling still once more, as if it was truly dead this time around. Rendered speechless, he flicked his finger and gathered a bundle of black flames infused with lightning and threatened, "Haven't you had your fun yet, or do you want to be roasted?" The koi fish on the ground flipped upward and stood up on its tail.
My apologies. It's just a habit of mine. I haven't been on the shore for so long that I had some trouble breathing when I came up, and I thought that I'd suffocate to death.
Sarah's cheeks twitched upon hearing those words. A fish actually stood up and began speaking. Furthermore, the fish seemed to have quite an eccentric personality. Don't underestimate this fellow. It's a sempiternal realm consummation cultivator. Putting aside coming onto shore, he wouldn't die even if he was thrown into a pot of boiling oil, Xavier explained. Sarah's initial shock slowly turned into intrigue as she asked, "If it possesses such strength, how did it end up being fished up?" A sempiternal realm consummation fish was likely to be a being of great intelligence, yet it had been fished up by an ordinary bamboo pole. This was unbelievable.
Oh, I can't help it. It was out of habit. But in the past, Keith Cole would often come to fish me. He'd hook me up each and every time before releasing me shortly after. Each time I'd be caught dozens of times, so I eventually got used to it.
The koi fish explained. Sarah's cheeks continued to twitch. Despite its strength, it still allowed itself to be hooked up each and every day. Furthermore, from the looks of it, it seemed to enjoy the process. Was it really that bored? More importantly, to fish the same fish every single day. Keith Cole must have been bored to death. Don't listen to his nonsense. If I'm not wrong, Keith Cole also used his gleam as his fishing line and bait. What this fellow's interested in isn't just the bait, but the fishing line as well. Am I right? Xavier shook his head with a light chuckle before turning his gaze to the koi fish.
It's all fleeting clouds,
the koi fish said in embarrassment. I see. Sarah widened her eyes in realization. It was no wonder an ordinary fish was able to cultivate to sempiternal realm consummation. It turned out it had been consuming Keith Cole's gleam all along. Naturally, there was no way that it would pass on such a delightful task to any other fish.
I thought that I'd hidden myself quite well earlier. How did you find me?
Asked the koi fish doubtfully as it turned to Xavier. The way that it had hidden itself was extremely discreet, such that it would have been nigh impossible for even those who possessed the eye of insight to see through its disguise. There were a few other groups who had arrived prior to them, but they had failed to notice its presence. Yet the young man had actually known that he needed to use a fishing rod to hook it up, and that had left it feeling itchy all over. As a result, it couldn't help but bite the bait and allow itself to be hooked up. The antidote that you've left inside the water is similar to my gleam. It's not something that anyone could create, Xavier explained. If I'm not mistaken, it probably originated from Keith Cole.